I ain't got nothing against no homosexual, man. But that's some bullshit, man.
It's nothing like having a nation of looking for you.
Listen, pal, I am a natural-born woman. Never had a jock strap. Never got a prostate exam.
She kind of bad, though. Is that Frost? I know I said no pause 2019. Over, I'm retracting that entire statement.
Discussing queerphobia in media, especially adult animation like the Boondocks, is always a difficult conversation to broach for a number of reasons. Bring it up about the Boondocks and you get told up and down that it's a satire and that you missed the point. Then you're treated to the millionth think piece about the death of media literacy and how this generation can't read to pathologize how wrong you are about not grasping the intricacies of pause. While it is known for its coverage of black issues, I don't think it's a secret the show really illustrates its weak points in its depictions of intersections within that, notably black women, black disabled people, and black queerness. You'll see comments like the Boondocks makes fun of people like you, in response to people agreeing with the homophobic attitudes being satirized, and in some cases that is true. But I think saying that also oversimplifies characters, like reducing Riley down to just a laughingstock for which homophobia exists. It erases and reduces the way we are still meant to understand him as a person and where he comes from, especially as a child. Also, as we're going to analyze and discuss, the Boondocks was just wrong or off the mark sometimes, and it's okay to say that. We'll also go over some of the behind-the-scenes issues surrounding the Boondocks, because much discussion of it gets reduced to seasons 1 through 3 were amazing and some of the best black TV out there, but everything changed when the Fire Nation kidnapped Aaron McGruder. Season 4 wasn't the same without him. It not only does a disservice to discussing the show itself, but also does a disservice to the collaborative work of the production team behind it. A lot of the cult of personality surrounding discussions of Aaron McGruder imagines him as this sort of divine truth teller, not afraid to piss anyone off, which even Aaron himself pushed back on in several interviews. I say this to bring up some of the broader issues about queerphobia and sexual violence in black media, because it's not just specific to the Boondocks and speaks to several larger industry problems. Let's get into it.
We hate black people.
In reviewing and analyzing black media, I think it's important to contextualize what circumstances works like the Boondocks are written under. Looking at the show's influences, the industry itself, and the economic circumstances of the time period bring out new insights you wouldn't notice just watching the show itself. The Boondocks is influenced by works like Star Wars, Peanuts, and several anime like Cowboy Bebop and Samurai Champloo, and the production team's knowledge and love of the history and culture of hip-hop and rap. There are so many design and musical choices and references that only make sense if you have an intimate enough knowledge with hip-hop. You can also see several shots of the Boondocks that are exact recreations of several scenes from their inspirations. You can make a drinking game out of the number of Cowboy Bebop and Star Wars references in the show. The Boondocks was born out of showing the perspective of black children experiencing the culture shift and interrogation of their blackness when moved to a predominantly white American suburb. Huey, Riley, Jasmine, and Caesar, if you read the comics, all navigate this with different specific nuances and way of attempting to reconnect with their sense of self. All of this was born from several of Aaron McGruder's own experiences navigating things and is a major part of the choice to set the Boondocks in a white suburb. Other series like The Fresh Prince and its reboot, Bel-Air, use a similar framing device, and it's a very effective way to describe this experience. Black artists overwhelmingly get funneled into getting to produce work discussing race and racism, and are far less funded when they are greenlit. I feel there's often not enough focus and discussion on how black talent mostly covering racism and socio-political topics creates another barrier in the sense that writing that shit is hard. To begin with, just because you're black doesn't mean you're automatically an expert. And even if you are, trying to discuss the kinds of topics like this requires a lot of care, nuance, and time to make sure you research and know what you're talking about. Yes, being black is a political act and every aspect of our lives is affected by politics. Several writers also just want to write about race, which is fine. What I'm discussing is the belief that blackness must be funneled into discussing the socio-political dynamics in all black works, which then ups the difficulty for artists trying to get into the industry even further. It's not discussed often enough as the labor tax it ends up being, and an added barrier to entry. Per the 2024 Hollywood Diversity Report, we can still see major racial disparities in leads, directors, and overall positions within film streaming in 2023. The report also found that streaming films led by non-white and women directors also saw casts that introduced more marginalized people themselves than by white men. There are also other reports out there that I looked into, but they all consistently say most of the same things. Racial, gender-based, and disability disparities, budgetary differences by race, and so on. The most effective way to influence diversity is to pick a marginalized director. The McKinsey & Company report, for instance, also arrives at a similar conclusion, but the company itself has a lot of issues to use it as a proper source. The Hollywood Jim Crow, which is a far stronger source, also goes into extensive detail and echoes similar sentiments. We also need to consider that this report is sponsored by Netflix, the Walt Disney Company, and Hulu, among others. So we could see any conclusions they want, and even then the disparities are still laid bare. Keep in mind, we also need to consider the effects of the still ongoing pandemic, as well as the conditions of exploitation that ramped up, especially with the advent of AI that led to the strikes in 2023. You're constantly placing Black people in situations where we're expected to discuss more complicated, often also triggering or exhausting material with the same harsh deadlines and less budget to work with. It results in a much higher difficulty in portraying Black people even when you're just writing from your own experiences. There's a shift season to season from how the Boondocks mostly focuses around the experiences of Black children in a predominantly white space, to instead turning largely to Riley's homophobia and Robert's mishaps. I think looking at how the focus and audience and how this had to be packaged as adult animation contributes to that. Adult animation is already saturated with loser adult men, and that shift in focus, particularly with Granddad's dating episodes as well as the adjustments to his personality, is really designed to better center that market. There's a binary way adult animation gets talked about, because so many of the shows are various bigotries put to screen under the excuse of we make fun of everyone. Entertainment gets looked at as fictionalized and detached from reality, because you can always just turn it off. The problem is that it is a multi-million-dollar industry, with one of the largest and most accessible media platforms with which to communicate to people, the vested political interests of executives who has access to said space. It's especially important to challenge this binary way of thinking when you consider how often what is labeled adult television also acts as a major platform through which to propagandize people, particularly young adults and minors onto the stuff in a way that parents need to monitor their kids does not address. We treat propaganda as something that only affects children. So because the bar is as low as the likes of Family Guy or South Park, it leads to other shows that surpass that and instead aim for more insightful political and social commentary to be put on a bit of a pedestal. Shows like Tuca and Birdie, BoJack Horseman, and the Boondocks do offer their fare of insightful storytelling, and this is not to imply otherwise. That said, it can be challenging to have genuine discussions about, say, the failings of how BoJack Horseman also mocks several queer identities because it gets labeled as queer positive. Because of how many ways it discusses the exploitative nature of the entertainment industry, it can be hard to broach the conversation of the ways BoJack Horseman repeatedly drops the ball and how it integrates race into that conversation. Something that even one of its main showrunners admits and agrees with. The conversation of queerphobia becomes difficult to talk about with the Boondocks because people extrapolate the show's quality in this respect because of the story of Gangstalicious Part 2. I also kind of want to push back on individualizing these issues, because even that doesn't still fully capture the picture. The production industry plays a major role in what sets up the conditions that lead to outcomes like this, something we'll go far more into depth with the conclusion. People like this don't pop up in isolation, it's by design. For now, there are other factors I want to bring into focus. The Boondocks ran from 2005 to 2014, so it not only ran through an economic recession, but also through the 2007-2008 Writers Guild of America strike. One of the driving factors was the boom of reality TV, which represented a means of generating a ton of published TV without having to properly pay the staff, much like the use of AI writing at this time. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Remember Kid Nation? Child labor laws, ethics, union and pay standards, what are those? This is one of the biggest drivers as to why if you go back and rewatch a lot of TV that aired around or after this time period, there is a massive drop in the quality of the writing. Even in a show that isn't directly affected by the loss in writers or other production staff, they still have to deal with the larger ecosystem affecting their work. You still have budgets, deadlines, and mandates to work around. And the Boondocks aired through this time period, something I feel contextualizes a lot of the quality of Season 3's writing in particular. I don't think this overturns the points I'll be making, because this still doesn't magically excuse the issues we'll be discussing. But it's important to remember that these are made by real people constantly affected by the circumstances of their employers, and that of the real world. I find sometimes reviewers talk about film and TV as if the industry is a neutral space that anyone has access to and censors the greatness of art, which leads to a lot of gaps when trying to give meaningful discussion. It's also known for some time now that government military institutions also have influence on works produced in exchange for the use of sites and resources in most cases. It's especially crucial to consider these elements and integrate them into your review, given the strikes in 2023, and we're seeing that same pattern again. Rather than just saying the writers ran out of ideas or were just lazy, you should at the very least put criticisms of work into perspective, especially if you're watching a show and getting the feeling that it felt rushed or directionless. The answer is likely the strikes or the pandemic that's still going on right now, if not both, such as the coercive exploitation via crunch that came about as the case with Across the Spider-Verse. The issues are also further exacerbated tenfold when you factor in added complexities for Black artists in film and TV. Now, I cannot in good faith co-sign a Marvel movie out of solidarity with the ongoing boycott in support of Palestine, but I bring this up instead to advocate for the animators behind the project and to establish the constant industry exploitation. I encourage you to participate in the BDS boycott for the people of Palestine if you have not already. The book All the Rage, The Boondocks Past and Present has several of the series' comics as well as numerous interviews with Aaron McGruder over the years. In reading through many of them, there's a pattern where interviews seem to want to position Aaron McGruder as this sort of hard-ass, ready to start fights with anyone and everyone, and go out of his way to piss everyone off. You can also see Aaron push back against that, because he more just says what he feels is necessary to say and what happens from it happens, but not necessarily going out of his way to anger everyone. It's a continued idea of imagining this sort of lone, singular cult of personality, where there's some black man who goes against the majority and isn't afraid to divine the truth they're trying to keep from you. You see it in the positioning of numerous black comedians like Dave Chappelle. As much as I hate what he does to my comments section, we'll talk more about him later.
But I don't lie to you. I'm just a guy. And I don't lie to you. And every institution that we trust lies to us.
I do think that there is validity in viewing Huey as that sort of mouthpiece, as a lot of the Boondocks is marketed around this idea of blackness as this provocative, controversial, daring voice to say some deep, hidden truth. A lot of the marketing when white reviewers talk about the Boondocks almost always comes back to and focuses on how the Boondocks is so critical of everyone, not just white people. You hear that? It makes fun of everyone. It hits both sides. A lot of it comes back to this underlying mindset supported that black racism is the only black thing that sells in Hollywood. Whiteness is viewed as the default, especially when intersecting with gender. So anything that strays from that must have a specific purpose for doing so. And statistically, the data supports that this is a commonly held belief among executives. Trying to make insightful, nuanced commentary about racial politics or current events and harsh deadlines are not a good combination. So how do stand-up comedians or TV shows like South Park manage to jump so quickly onto current events while still having something meaningful to say?
That's the neat thing. You don't.
They can only talk about things that are current because they have very little insightful information to say, and instead repeat decades worth of bigotries. Just pick out a political topic, popular or in public focus at the time, say some ridiculously bigoted shit, and because it generates enough attention, just profit from the controversy. Even if the harm you cause from normalizing or emboldening the beliefs you repeated will continue happening. If that sounds like YouTube summed up in a paragraph, yeah. The Boondocks was heavily marketed in relation to the controversy it caused, and almost every mention of it in books or reviews sees it described in relation to that same heat of controversy. The ability to say the deep truth that everyone else is too afraid to say. I mean, hell, the book is called All the Rage. All of this is to say deadlines are hard. Writing about more complicated things like race and politics on a deadline is even harder. Deadlines, both during the comic series run and during the TV series run, were always one of the biggest stressors for Aaron McGruder. Contrary to public opinion, Aaron McGruder more or less was involved in Season 4, which had several behind-the-scenes challenges tied mostly to deadlines and workload, something we'll go into more depth during the conclusion. Trying to write this kind of thing, even when balanced with more lighthearted episodes all the time, is hard as shit, and then add in a deadline. At one point, he had been hospitalized from stress, from tremendous GI disorders, and had felt it come and go over the course of months. This work also seriously and negatively affected McGruder's personal life and relationships. So when I say this is a lot, I really want to emphasize that you can't really review writing like this without immersing yourself in the circumstances it was written under, and that holds especially true for Black writers. If you listen to behind-the-scenes footage on the DVDs, or the post-show discussions and interviews, the production team is well aware of several of the rightful criticisms the series got, but have a pretty dismissive stance toward it or just brush it off as everyone's mad about something. In All the Rage, the introduction has a section where Aaron talks about the nature of controversy, using an example where he pulled a story about Huey starting a clan watch, and replaced it with Huey and Riley playing with lightsabers as a sort of lighthearted breather episode, which ended up sparking a ton of controversy while the clan strip got very little attention. And it's the way Aaron discusses controversy here, particularly the part that they just see it as a normal part of business and just pull and ignore it because we got deadlines. It's sound enough advice with the example given. But the other side of controversy is that the artist isn't always right. So what do you do when the criticism and controversy you receive is warranted? I'm sure there are instances where this happens and it's not just been vocalized here by Aaron or really any of the production team. You can see how these conditions make a horrible combination, right? The industry is already inequitable as shit because most marginalized people, especially looking at intersectionality, like Black women, Black disabled, and Black queer people are not welcome into this space unless they're willing to consciously align with the white gaze and basically put out minstrelsy. It creates an environment wherein the few people there are rarely challenged, where few people have knowledge about marginalized people, and where Black artists are already under stressful situations expected to not be bankable and not receptive to criticism. It also doesn't fully address the issue to simply hire marginalized people with more expertise, because oftentimes when you do, they become tokenized and are often put in positions where others have far more power and leverage over them, and aren't receptive to genuine feedback. In other words, it sets up the conditions for you to dismiss any genuine input and proper growth, which conflicts horribly with having to write about Black politics and race. It's not a one-off incident that Carl Jones is the kind of dude to go on about how stifling so-called sensitive people are to comedy. Someone who frames Dave Chappelle's queerphobia and misogynoir, issues in his work that date back to his older, more popular material, as just people being too sensitive, and who sees criticizing as stifling, isn't going to be open to feedback on a deadline, even if you have someone to provide that input. Short answer, yes. Hire Black women. Hire Black, queer, and disabled people who know this shit. But we can't get there by looking at this purely in individual terms, because the conditions and surrounding elements that make up the film and TV industry will continue to bring out these situations if we continue as is. With that in mind, let's start discussing the good, the bad, and the season 4 of the Boondocks, starting with the story of Gangstalicious.
This is about thuggin' love.
The episode centers around Riley watching a special on one of his favorite rappers, Gangstalicious, who ends up getting shot by some dudes who ran up on him, and so he's currently hospitalized. Riley's motivated to help him as a fellow street soldier, even though he's, 8. So Riley's invested in this as an actual struggle for someone he largely holds a very parasocial relationship with. And a great deal of Riley's character is in the dissonance with the image he has of people he views and identifies with on TV versus the reality of who they are off camera.
Message!
The book Watching While Black, centering the television of Black audiences, makes a note about the line of perception versus reality being blurred in discussing the portrayal of the episode, particularly with the scene where Gangstalicious is shot on stage and people don't bother helping him when he's actually shot because they see it as part of the performance. After some silliness, Riley makes it to the hospital and meets Gangstalicious in person, only to have the hardened thug image he so strongly identified with continually shattered. Gangstalicious lies and says that he was shot by some dudes he owed money to while in the drug game, which Riley latches onto for being real. I think this is also a good way to discuss how often Riley's character gets oversimplified, and why hip-hop, or at least the crafted image it sells, is so important to him in a way his family doesn't understand. The Boondocks is a show about Black people and how they are forced to adapt because they've been moved to a predominantly white suburb where their Blackness is constantly criminalized and interrogated under a white gaze, something that greatly shapes both Huey and Riley's behavior. Both of them immerse themselves in different aspects of Black culture as a way to make a claim of their sense of racial identity and masculinity in an environment that constantly is hostile to them. See, predominantly white spaces are exhausting to be in. It's why so many Black TV shows opt to discuss the double consciousness of having to navigate predominantly white spaces, having people who see you as something to consume, as a threat, as a mindless fool.
We never asked to move here with your precious new white people, Granddad.
In Riley's case, he emulates and identifies with rap and hip-hop, as well as mafia and gang movies, which acts as a twofold form of commentary. First, this is the main source of identification Riley has, because he emulates the things he's exposed to in the media, despite the fact that, as we previously discussed, it represents a very stereotyped commodity that is largely shaped by the whims of wealthy white executives. Second, the image Riley identifies with is one that is intentionally targeted toward black people to perpetuate a stereotype notion of what blackness must look like in men and boys. These are images and stereotypes with centuries of precedent. Riley values the blackness as portrayed in the media he sees, and with that comes all the harmful portrayals normalized through what he watches, including queerphobia and misogyny. As Riley quickly figures out, his image of what a black man should be like is shattered upon meeting Gangstalicious, who is nothing but a brand, one who takes a harmful and incorrect image of what blackness should be, as presented and exploited by white producers and black actors willing to align with that. This acts as the series' way of critiquing the larger picture, which is the normalization of problem elements in the media. That's a big part of my problem with people who reduce Riley as just a joke to make fun of homophobes, because it feels like an incomplete picture and kind of contributes to that idea of looking at Huey as the good or right one and Riley as the bad one. Riley is still incredibly talented and intelligent, and the discussions about Riley's behavior look at him individualized, without tying things back to the media and specific aspect of hip-hop he identifies with. In the episode Riley Was Here, everyone assumes Riley is lying, because his art is being viewed under a white gaze, and everyone assumes that as a black boy, he can only do harm. He's a talented liar, and it must have been someone else. He's rightfully bothered by all of that, but it's hearing that from his own grandfather that hurts the most. He's a kid that wants to be accepted and recognized more than anything. When they think that Riley's spray paint art is done by someone they deem proper, they not only don't criminalize his actions, they want to pay money for it. But when a black boy comes to take credit for his work, they all laugh at him. I do think that due to deadline constraints and likely the way a lot of adult shows tend to get funneled into a very specific genre and artist, that over time Riley gets sidelined into having a lot of that second half of his character under-focused, and instead is just made to be more of a vehicle for shock value. Over time, there's a shift in the focus that centers the adults more over the children, which is not inherently a bad thing, but I think it does contextualize how Riley isn't talked about in a way that reaches the bigger picture. Riley Was Here encapsulates being a black artist, of having any of your thoughts trampled on, stolen, and never recognized, but appreciated when you center the right people. Not the biggest fan of the Huey B-plot for a few reasons, like the high-key classist way it communicates Huey as being portrayed as less than with how he speaks, but still a great episode overall. Gangstalicious gets worried when Riley points out there's no security, cops, or protection. But he still tries to hold on to his image, and how he tries to act like he would just take out the cops when he wants them there for protection. So some niggas come in with the intention of taking Gangstalicious out, and so he and Riley escape. More and more, Riley is noticing things like how Gangstalicious is much shorter in person and how panicked Gangstalicious is, which he tries to play off as being medicated. Gangstalicious being afraid is perfectly natural. When he fires his gun, he's a terrible shot and drops his weapon, to which Riley says is very not gangsta and he's a fraud. It's like going to heaven and finding God smoking crack. Riley also assumes he just owns a jet based on one of his videos, which they rented. In reality, the gangsta shit Riley aspires to was always a fabricated image, but one that appeals to Riley as a means to reclaim his black identity. After the funniest scene in the episode, with Gangstalicious rolling up the car window to keep the dudes out, the two are captured and put in a trunk while we get this slower, more pensive moment from Gangstalicious, who apologizes to Riley for getting him dragged into the situation. During this, he talks about how when he was Riley's age, he admired Ice Cube, who Riley just sees as the dude who makes family movies, which makes sense given their age difference. Gangstalicious grew up in the 80s and 90s era of hip-hop, thinking to NWA and Ice Cube's music career after too. Riley just knows him as that nigga in Are We There Yet? Remember, Aaron McGruder talked about how his political perspective as a young adult was shaped by hip-hop's political era. So a lot of this is Riley coming to terms with the fabrication he's always idolized versus the real person behind the image who, like Riley, also identified with the fabrication himself. He isn't that different from Riley, who didn't even know that Ice Cube was a rapper and only associates him with family movies, which places what time periods of hip-hop the two of them identified so strongly with. This isn't the Boondocks' first time taking shots at Ice Cube, so I always welcome the Ice Cube slander. Ice Cube himself is a perfect example too, because a lot of his rap career image revolved around positioning himself as this pro-black, cop-hating rebel who rejects the man. In reality, Ice Cube has a history of repeating conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic bigotries, he supported Autism Speaks, and is a MAGA-supporting anti-vaccine capitalist far more aligned with imperial power structures than his thug image would suggest. I even previously discussed this in talking about the image of Ice Cube versus the actual Ice Cube, and how it contributes to the anti-black narrative present in the film TMNT Mutant Mayhem. We also see this fabricated image a lot with Thugnificent, who, despite being a commodity, compares himself with and considers himself an extension of civil rights black activists. It becomes clear that the image becomes a tool to acquire wealth and capital for him, reinforcing a specific and narrow image of what black masculinity is to look like. It's an identifiable commodity for white children as well. Great episode.
And for some reason, I thought he was so cool, and I wanted to be him when I started to act like that, like a killer. But I really wasn't that person.
So the climactic scene with Gangstalicious shows us 19 minutes into the 22-minute episode that Gangstalicious is gay. This is his ex who he cheated on, the one who calls him Frederick rather than his stage name. We're then shown Riley's reaction of shock and disgust toward learning that the man he idolized is gay, fainting at the sight after the shooters missed. Riley then lies by insisting that he was struck and hallucinated that they kissed, even insisting that he shot one of the dudes at the hospital. A big theme in this episode is the perception versus reality, and the episode ends on a lie from Riley. The first episode, despite centering around Riley and Gangstalicious, actually doesn't give much to discuss with respect to queerness, except for the fact that we're shown at the very end that Gangstalicious is gay. Luckily, these dudes and their stormtrooper aim means that we manage to barely dodge bearing our gaze here. It's a very common trope to introduce queer characters and brutally kill them just as quickly in a bout of trauma to consume for cishet audiences. I want to be clear in that inclusion of violence toward queer characters is not an inherently harmful thing to do, as it's a very real and relevant problem. But what we see with the Boondocks is indicative of how queerness is handled in a lot of media, where the revelation of a character's queerness is framed as a last-minute reveal to shock a character, and for the audience to have a last-minute laugh at the shock and disgust the character feels toward them. That's also reinforced in how Gangstalicious runs for his life, but they play this lighthearted music to go with it. So while Riley does exist for a very targeted reason and is representative of a very specific kind of black child who identifies a lot with hip-hop culture and history, that being the case does not overturn the way this concept of queerness as a last-minute shocking reveal frequently gets used in media, relying on the audience perception of agreeing with the shock and disgust to end things on a lighter tone. It's also not lost on me how this moment is also perceived in the way that it's currently seeing a resurgence with the information coming out about Diddy, which I hate people. You see, often when things like this happen, people turn to it looking as this kind of confirmation, like, oh, the Boondocks predicted this, without paying any mind to what was actually happening, because they reinforce what I'm talking about and how just the idea of queer people existing is enough to get a laugh. We'll save that for the section about the Booty Warrior, which will discuss the way sexual violence is depicted in the Boondocks. So while the episode does urge the viewer to question very important issues, like the nature of broadcast media, and specifically the crafted image of hip-hop artists, it doesn't make its ending immune to perpetuating some of that same homophobia. Riley identifies so strongly with this music and the image of the hardened thug, because it represents a way to claim and define his sense of masculinity within a predominantly white suburb that constantly interrogates and belittles him for his blackness. Without getting into any one specific episode, the Boondocks makes frequent use of homophobic, ableist, and transphobic slurs. It frequently uses queer and disabled people as objects of ridicule toward characters in ways that don't deconstruct these or humanize the people this language is meant to belittle.
I want to rep something that don't sound fat.
And I ain't talking about them super steroided she-males in the Olympics that tuck their testicles up either. Man, your damn business.
And she probably a man.
Shut up.
Faggot boy.
It's not that it'd be better if they had a token queer person in their production team, but I still will immediately side-eye a work like this repeating ableist, homophobic, and transphobic slurs for the audience to get a laugh at on the regular. It's a different situation from black creators using the N-word. It's not lost on me that this is a show full of characters who are intentionally awful or incorrect people that we're not necessarily meant to agree or sympathize with. It is a racial and political satire after all. That said, there are a number of moments that still reinforce or assume we agree with those wrong perspectives for the humor to work, something that will become far more relevant later. It's hard for me to come away with more grace knowing what's around the corner. Only in rare instances do queer themes or elements actually come out in a humanizing way, and the majority of the show is designed to imagine blackness and the discussion surrounding it within the confines of cisheteronormativity. The important takeaway of this episode is what a great display of what Riley's character is about, and the larger commentary behind it. And Gangstalicious being gay is less a story element to grapple with and discuss, and more the final nail in the coffin to shatter Riley's image of masculinity. It's not the worst episode by any means, but it still highlights a lot of similar tropes and framing that other TV shows also engage in. But what about part 2? This is probably the most discussed episode, and unlike this one, makes the aspect of queerness the main topic for the episode's runtime.
Gay?
While Season 1 only gave Gangstalicious a last-minute reveal of his sexuality, Season 2 gives a sequel to Gangstalicious and his story, which dives fully into the discussion of homophobia and black masculinity. The episode starts with Riley watching Gangstalicious's premiere of his new music video, Homies Over Hoes. It's obviously extremely homoerotic and unsubtle about it, with the repeated line, "Do the homie." The song is also misogynistic in how it delivers that message. Where musicians like Thugnificent and his song unsubtly named Rags to Bitches centers around treating a woman as a form of sexual conquest, Gangstalicious markets his closeted queer expression through a lens that the limits of cis-heteronormativity will allow, mutating it to his queer-phobic audience that he himself partially contributes to as a sort of men going their own way expression of masculinity. So it's important to understand the dissonant way people engage with Gangstalicious and his work, because it doesn't matter what they're actually doing. These are people conditioned to accept, within the confines of cis-heteronormativity, that they have ways of performing their masculinity that they deemed acceptable.
You can't just go throwing that gay thing around, Huey. That's a serious accusation.
You can't tell through looks alone if someone is gay or really any kind of queer identity. But it doesn't stop people from performing different actions or clothes that become associated with that can then be weaponized by people in power to police behavior, shape public opinion, or to market and sell products. Don't cross your legs, don't open your legs, don't drink tea, be nice to your friends, laugh, cry, dress a certain way, look a certain way, wear colors, because it'll make you gay. I seriously saw one of those how to tell if your man is DL videos, and they seriously suggested that being attracted to disabled people makes you gay. Conveniently, Dr. Umar or whoever profiteer it is next will be there to capitalize on your insecurities. Imperial powers have a convenient target to vilify as an evil other. Listen to Dr. Umar, he'll try to convince you of some nonsense that Little Bear was after his snow bunny and trying to impress little Emily. Don't worry, Little Bear, I'll always know where your heart is. But seriously, Dr. Umar needs to be thrown into the sun. You remember that picture of Rihanna and they were talking about the emasculation of black men nonsense, even though it was literally just a married couple? But we broke out the lines and shit analyzing the super emasculation. Rihanna apparently was not being submissive. And it's all just bullshit. That's all it is. But this policing of how we perform our gender and stick to these asinine ideas as ways to avoid being perceived as queer is a form of why queerphobia has such dire consequences. In the end, everybody immediately assumes that Riley must be gay because of how he dresses and how he performs his masculinity to the public, and you can't base someone's sexuality off of those things. A big focus of the episode is the way homophobia, as perpetuated by black men, comes because of an insecurity leading to have to constantly prove and assert masculinity and heteronormativity, and the way that Gangstalicious and his music doesn't change, but their perception of people does when they either assume that they are queer based on perception and performance, like with Riley, or when they actually are, like with Gangstalicious. Black men are continually hypersexualized and hypermasculinized because of that previously mentioned brute caricature tied to our identities. So a great deal of this is an attempt to reclaim a sense of black masculinity, but doing so uncritically and in a way that is not conscious of the main driver putting that belief in place. The next scene is Gangstalicious showing off his clothing line that were meant to take as obvious queer elements in the clothing choices. Gangstalicious continually cloaks his views through a layer of misogyny by saying we're not doing it for the females, that we're just doing the fashion for us. So Gangstalicious is in effect pioneering his work in a way that is seen as pretty queer, with the point being that over time, what was considered masculine has always been pretty open and silly, and what was considered gay or effeminate has always shifted through the years. Contrast this with Thugnificent, who also shows up in this episode. Thugnificent is a rapper all about status and wrapping himself up as an activist in a commodified take on rap. Someone who grew up poor and his tagline "rags to bitches" is all about using women as sexual conquest. But neither Gangstalicious nor Thugnificent have any frame of reference for the history of where this need to be hypermasculine performers of sexual conquest came from, and how the image of the thug, as we discussed in the last part, was born out of anti-black notions in slavery. They consciously choose to be puppets for industries that profit from them perpetuating this narrow idea of masculinity, which in turn younger viewers like Riley uncritically internalize. It's not enough to simply be with a woman, but to perform your relationship with her in a very specific way. Don't be feminine, which can include things like wearing socks with your shoes. I seriously saw that one. Don't be bisexual. Don't walk a certain way, sit a certain way, wear certain clothes, say this, not that, and so on.
Hey, we sound like a bunch of bitch niggas that need women in their lives or something, man.
What I'm saying, we calling them bitches and hoes and shit. It ain't like we respecting them or nothing like that.
This uncritical performance results in Thugnificent and his crew sending a pair of women out because of their own misogyny. The woman walks back in on all of them doing the homie, and it's meant to illustrate their dissonant performance of black masculinity that loops around to them not being intimate with women, because that's seen as a betrayal of hypermasculinity imposed onto black men and boys. Riley calls Gangstalicious to set up a thing to get in with Thugnificent on the remix, so they find him profitable. Black queer people have pioneered so much in the way of fashion, music, memes, and culture that we don't get credited for, and that speaks to a lot of the appropriative nature of black queer influence on our culture. A lot of elements of what is considered queer culture or history is taken specifically from black queer individuals in a way that excludes us. Those very same people also participate in the same stigma and violence toward black queer people. Gangstalicious is also a trendsetter, but it must be stripped away of his explicit queerness to be considered marketable. You can also kind of see this in the way Gangstalicious feels a bit forced in his line delivery. Like he doesn't know how to act when straight men talk about women, and it gives the impression he's picked up over time how to perform straightness in public. So Robert freaks out over seeing Riley dressed the way he is, with it showing the ways that Gangstalicious has marketed gender nonconformity in a way that imagines it as thugged. So Robert does the rational thing and turns to Ruckus as the first person to reach out to. Great idea there, Robert. Anyway, Ruckus takes one look at Riley wearing clothes and walking out the door with his hand like this, and he says that's all the evidence you need right there, and it's not at all. None of that is a confirmation of someone being gay, not that it'd be a harmful thing if it was. This kind of illustrates a lot of the frivolous nature of the gay scare rhetoric and how it can be weaponized on an institutional level. Take the lavender scare, the removal of queer people from federal government positions on the grounds that they were more susceptible to blackmail because of their queerness and were of weak moral character. It also sees public health consequences. The handling of HIV and AIDS is probably one of the most well-known examples. Every few months, black social media has waves of some cishet person saying how they would never date a bisexual person, or if they do, people in the comments telling them that they need to get tested. It imagines queerness as an infection, and that the depraved queer deviant plague bearers are people you need to avoid, lest you become depraved yourself. In recent news, Scott Galloway, a NYU professor, had some acephobic nonsense to say about student protesters advocating for an end to the genocide and occupation of Palestine. He claims that they're increasingly acting like the you-know-who of World War II Germany. He attributes the root cause of protesters being young people not having enough sex, thus they go on the hunt for fake threats. This, of course, is a massive misrepresentation of the issue surrounding why people are protesting. It's ultimately for a ceasefire, to pressure universities into divesting, considering their financial and imperial interest in aiding Palestinian genocide, and erasing the fact that Jewish people are also victims in Palestine too, and make up several of the protesters, a fact that is continually and consciously erased in the media coverage of these events. There was also a sign of ground rules protesters at George Washington University made, which people jumped on in how they positioned protesters as sexual Puritans or oppressors that hate sex. Now, of course, this is an extremely reasonable guideline to set for protesters, because it's a recognition of an abuse of power through relationships that can form within advocacy groups. It's not anti-sex, it's recognizing the ways that they're here for business. Both of these situations imagine a lack of sex or perceived aversion to it as a form of deviancy. Lack of sex is imagined as a form of immorality and depravity, that sees sex as a fuel for morality and productivity. The conclusion of this line of thinking also then decides that it's women's duty to provide this for men, lest they become immoral, violent agitators. All of this showcases the many ways queer deviancy through transphobia, bi, ace, homophobia, and so on manifest and the real-world consequences it brings about. That's the kind of sentiment being highlighted here. Robert is trying to find ways to connect with Riley, who has turned to doing things like sewing, painting his nails, and shopping, none of which is a confirmation of his queerness. Robert's idea of fixing this is to go hit on girls and play football. He then gets the idea that if somebody talks to Riley about sex, that it'll all straighten itself out. But when Ruckus asks if he'll do it, he uncomfortably says no. He does the rational thing again and turns to a pimp named Slickback, the most blatantly misogynistic option possible. But this also illustrates how the problem stems from how the men in Riley's life have their own damaged conception of masculinity and gender. They're uncomfortable talking about or thinking about sex and all have stereotyped images of black men and boys through the messaging and communication they've received all their lives. These images represent a commodification through which women disproportionately suffer. Thugnificent and a pimp named Slickback both commodify this image as the pimp and thug. As we showed earlier, these are ideas that are modernized elements of the black brute mired in slavery. Pimps are often looked to as a form of sexual conquest over women, despite the fact that it's not their thing. Pimps like money, not women. Sex workers are bodies of labor for them, and the abuse and exploitation of sex workers gets turned into a performance of masculinity that sees the proximity to women and control over them as a way to affirm their masculine identity. Robert then tries Tom, who points out that it's not a problem that he's gay. They again are still working from an incorrect premise. Tom mentions that he won't have to worry about any accidental great-grandkids, which is not necessarily true, but one of the most important and telling things from Robert comes out. He genuinely is trying to bring himself to accept Riley being gay, and says this.
I'm from the old school. I mean, I ain't homophobic, but gay men give me the heebie-jeebies.
Robert is homophobic here. White supremacist ideas about black masculinity and the black brute shape this. The whole thing comes from centuries of history and is then perpetuated by the media, which the episode highlights through the way that Gangstalicious is a commodity and a means for Thugnificent's crew to get on the financial profit as well. Jessica Ethelberg, the woman Gangstalicious had been dating, outs him as gay in her book. Riley takes it as an attack on himself, saying that he's gay himself if he's friends with or associated with queerness, as queer people are imagined as plague bearers. Everyone distances themselves from Gangstalicious despite nothing happening or changing. It's also important to remember that Gangstalicious responds to the claims in a way that reaffirms his misogyny. I ain't got an answer to no bitch. This is exactly the kind of shit a scandalous hoe is good for. They're notorious for snitching, you know? By saying she's a snitch, he's basically confirmed that her claims are true. And not this dude saying, I knew it, I always knew I had a feeling about that dude, which he never vocalizes. Thugnificent and his crew don't want to work with him, so they just hide. They don't even decline. They just ice him out because of their own gay panic and isolate him. And they make sure to emphasize how biting the silence is, how painful it is to be ignored without needing to say why. Then Granddad makes this a truly powerful scene. I kinda hate how Robert gradually gets flanderized into standard adult TV show protagonist as kind of a shit. But we see Robert genuinely reach out to and affirm his love for Riley. It's especially important given Robert's age, but it shows that these were never static, natural beliefs, nor were they ever products of their time. You can make the effort to challenge them and support the people in your life. Riley not actually being gay doesn't change the way that Robert making a genuine effort to question his ideas about blackness, about masculinity, and sexuality is made so important. Because this moment between them is juxtaposed with the way actual black queer people like Gangstalicious are affected by these sentiments. Then he says it. It's really over. It's interesting because in performing this falsified image perpetuated through media and specifically through rap, that Gangstalicious is also the very image of the thing that stigmatizes him, and he further perpetuates it through the Misogynoir in his work. Finally, Gangstalicious and Riley face each other, after both went through an extremely emotional time, and Riley asks outright, "Are you gay?" We get a pause and some reflection from the gay rappers who have been narrating the episode. Frederick does not come out. He retreats back to the thug persona. He continues that same performance, the performance imposed by the broader society. It's a shield created out of necessity. Gangstalicious says that homies don't listen to what a sex worker says, and that is gay. He then chooses not to come out, because again, one of his most loyal fans engages in that same queerphobic attitude himself, and only comes back to respecting him upon having his masculinity interrogated. Which honestly isn't Riley's business in the first place, and the whole dynamic of an 8-year-old and a grown celebrity is already not a relationship, and more a way to keep Riley from talking. So things go back to normal in that Riley respects him, but it's a respect that still communicates that harm which Gangstalicious knows, and it highlights the problem. Gangstalicious has to perform how much he hated the kiss in line, but the problem still exists. The thing about DL men is that straight people created and necessitated DL culture. Too many cishet black men perpetuate this in their pursuit of masculinity, without examining the ways that hypermasculinity as a concept is imposed onto us black men by white supremacists. Too many cishet black women act like bisexual people are all predatory, plague-bearing cheaters on the DL, while contributing to the very stigma that keeps people in the closet to begin with. I kinda wish that Gangstalicious was a character who showed up as a regular each season instead of Stinkmeaner. Like, how does Gangstalicious fare in the broader picture? You're telling me that a gay black celebrity was in communication with an 8-year-old and the media wouldn't try to immediately jump on labeling him a predatory gay man? What about a movement of black queer people who feel seen and identify with him, or the fact that he's not the only one? The story of Gangstalicious Part 2 is a major improvement over the first one, and is an easy contender for one of the best episodes of the Boondocks period. Having said that, I always hesitate in singing this episode's praises, because while it raises some very salient points in an effective satirical lens, it doesn't feel like the show's creative attitude within production decided to practice that same mindfulness toward black queer people.
As a modern American man, I am woefully unprepared to manage a woman's emotions.
Before we discuss later episodes in Pause, A Date with the Booty Warrior, and The New Black, their problems make more sense with an understanding of Misogynoir and its siblings. It's not possible to understand queerphobia without Misogynoir, and vice versa, especially without it centering transness. When we talk about desirability politics, it often gets reduced to just dating interests, and is talked about in a way that's assumed to be random and uncontrollable. It's just my preference is the first reaction many have. Desirability is less who do you want to date, and more who does society condition us to see as human, and thus worth caring about. It establishes a hierarchy that others people. It recognizes how the way that we perceive others, including finding attraction to them, doesn't exist in isolation. In the context of discussing desirability in media, desirability becomes a form of communication, about who we see as the butt of the joke, who we see as sympathetic, and who is worth caring about. It's done through character designs and storytelling. For instance, women with thin bodies, straight hair, and white or light skin are assumed to be better, more moral, more sympathetic, and more human. In 2016, Vice put out an article titled "The Defiant Femininity of Israel's Female Soldiers." It's a photo shoot of conventionally attractive women in military uniform. Thin bodies, straight hair, light white skin. We see the way that it uses those elements of desirability to position the military as this benevolent force that empowers women. It whitewashes the nature of the military's ongoing genocide and occupation of Palestine. They're still using this exact technique. It's not a coincidence that articles like this emphasize depicting women who meet the standards of Eurocentric beauty to obscure their true nature. This article, and others like it, were rightfully criticized for the propaganda they represent. Noah Hassan makes the observation that the achievement of empowering women comes at the front of ethnically cleansing native Palestinians. The denial of their femininity is heavily portrayed in these videos, but they are still committing genocide that contributes to masculinity. Understanding the mechanics of desirability will help you understand how it's used in propaganda surrounding any of the ongoing genocides right now, to help shape and frame who is to be seen as human. For now, let's look at Max from Living Single. Max is one of 2 dark-skinned characters in the main cast of 6, and the only dark-skinned woman. Within the show, she's frequently insulted in a way that sees her as mannish, masculine, and beast-like. In one episode, the girls hang out at a gay bar. Setting aside the whole issue of what are straight women intruding on a queer space, they all have very relatable conversations with the queer members of the bar. It's meant to convey a normalized look at queer, or rather cis-queer people, and how they have everyday conversations without the story feeling the need to make jokes or humor at the expense of queerness. Nearly everyone has a positive experience with the queer members except for Max. You see, she's hit on by presumably a gay man who incorrectly believes she's trans, and is put off upon finding she's a cis woman. I want to show a clip here, and I'd like you to take note of when the laugh track comes up.
Pardon me, but has anyone ever told you that you are stunning?
Not in this place.
You know you've done an amazing job of hiding that stubble, and your Adam's apple is practically invisible.
Well, why in the hell would I have stubble? What's it?
Oh, so you're really into the role-playing thing, huh? Okay.
Listen, pal, I am a natural-born woman. Never had a jock strap. Never got a prostate exam. In fact, I'm ovulating as we speak.
A woman? Thanks for wasting my time, sicko.
The whole joke is built on the idea that of course Max is mistaken for a trans woman because she's dark-skinned, thus she's mannish and must be trans. The two factors, transness and being dark-skinned, are both things viewed as undesirable per Eurocentrism, to the point where they become interchangeable for this joke. Now, this guy in the context of the episode was flirting with her, but it's not about his individual thoughts about Max, but more how the choice in laugh track directs us to see Max as being ungendered as a form of comedy. That's why those talking points about the stubble and the Adam's apple become points the man looks for in trying to detect a trans woman. It's a colorist joke at Max's expense that's rooted in trans misogyny. If this was just a neutral or trans-positive moment of a queer person preferring to be with a trans person or a cross-dresser, the two are not interchangeable, they would not have selected those points at the laugh track to guide the viewer in on trying to clock Max as trans and getting a laugh out of it. What's more, the way Max responds is also trans-misogynistic, as it relies on bioessentialism, which is basically a belief that different things, in this case womanhood, is fixed, innate, and tied to bodily functions or parts, which is why Max lists out all these things to suggest that she is a natural woman and not a pretend, or the implied part, a trans woman in the story's parlance. So while the episode does not directly antagonize the queer characters themselves through its narrative, it still singles out trans femininity specifically and does not recognize trans femme individuals as who they actually are. It relies on colorism to that end. These things are meant to be used as fixed ways to try and declare whether someone is a man or a woman, but these body parts and bodily functions are not universal for any women, whether cis or trans. It becomes especially apparent in how many of these bioessentialist beliefs fail to consider and continually erase intersex people as well. What we're seeing happen to Max here is ungendering, a way of robbing her of her womanhood because she is frequently antagonized in a way the other women are not because of her dark skin. This translates into the way we talk about people outside of fiction as well. Taya Moy Roberts writes extensively in a manuscript about the way Megan Thee Stallion is talked about in regard to Tory Lanez shooting her. The idea behind ungendering someone is that they are reduced to flesh, because they are recognized not as people but as property. This manuscript references rapper Cameron, who posted about Megan getting shot by Tory Lanez. He concedes that Tory shot her, but believes she deserved it. It communicates that violence toward women he deems undesirable, or people Cameron does not consider women, i.e. trans women, are an acceptable target for violence. In doing this, numerous people imagine her as trans because they don't see her as human. Her sense of humanity is conditional on her desirability in their eyes, hence they ungender her. Now, only trans people experience transphobia. It's important to discuss it in a way that directly censors trans people. That's why we call this ungendering rather than transphobia. It's vital that we not discuss it as if it is an extension of issues for cis people to get centered in. Ungendering also sees legal, economic, social, and medical consequences in how we develop this understanding of race and gender. Let's look at a more recent example.
Why you quiet?
Nah, I'm just in shock.
What you in shock about?
Damn. Okay.
Can you get 360?
Yeah, can I get 360 real quick? God damn. Okay. It's just...
Wait, huh?
What's the problem?
I'm good. I'm just...
I don't like the silence.
What the I bought her for you, bro.
What is you talking about? Like, what's going on?
Why they said jawline?
Wait, whoa.
What the... Nah.
No. 100%
woman out of here.
No, Jew, you good.
Come back.
Jew, you good.
10 million. Kai has over 10 million followers as of May of 2024. Let that level of influence sink in. Think about how many boys and young adult men in particular replicate this. It's not just jokes and comedy, when it's the same set of narratives you're bombarded with on a constant basis and on such a wide scale. In Family Guy, Ida Quagmire, who is a trans woman that recently underwent surgery for her transition process, incorrectly assumes that Meg must be trans too, with the joke being that Meg is regarded as fat and ugly, so of course she's trans. The movie also has a similar joke where Meg in the future now goes by Ron and is shown to be a man. The mere fact of Ron being trans ends up being a joke in and of itself. It's also further supported by Seth MacFarlane's comments about the reception toward the Ida Quagmire episode of Family Guy, and how he communicates his own disgust toward trans bodies. If I found out that I had slept with a trans person, I might throw up. It's just the way we're biologically wired. This is about what he thought was a genuinely sympathetic portrayal of a trans woman, where a womanizer vomits for half a minute at the realization that he hooked up with her. Really sit with that. Really sit with how his attitudes toward trans women get written off as just the way we're biologically wired. Watch any predominantly black TV show and look at how they treat the one or two dark-skinned characters in it versus the light-skinned cast, especially with how they treat dark-skinned women. Dark skin is treated as inherently masculinizing and aggressive, with black bodies assumed to be large and violent. How many black TV shows will have a cast of almost entirely dark-skinned people except the daughter or mother? One feature of desirability is fluid enough to be interchangeable with another. Max must be trans because she's dark-skinned. Meg is mistaken for trans because she's seen as ugly and fat. They become interchangeable because they are all seen as less than within a Eurocentric hierarchy. One of the biggest flaws the Boondocks has is Misogynoir. This was an element shown as early as the comics. Take this strip, with the punchline centering around how Condoleezza Rice is made more feminine with a Darth Vader fit. If you're not aware, Condoleezza Rice was the US Secretary of State, having served as the National Security Advisor to then-President George W. Bush, and the Boondocks comics had a few strips usually taking shots at her for her conservative views. But this joke isn't about the things you could poke fun at in her politics. It's a dig at her femininity as a black woman. There's also a subplot where Huey and Caesar try to find Condoleezza Rice a man in the hopes of making her a better person, that even the comic itself points out the inherent sexism of. But simply lampshading that it's sexist doesn't take away from how I mean, it's sexist. And the S word, we see a similar thing done to Ann Coulter, a conservative pundit, where Ruckus points out that she has a very prominent Adam's apple, but is nonetheless all woman to him. There's an underlying assumption that Ann Coulter might secretly be a man because she has a visible Adam's apple, a line of thinking frequently leveraged against trans women as a way to try and catch them, or see them as gay or deceitful men, or infiltrators.
Veronica is a man.
Look at the size of that Adam's apple.
The joke again imagines Ann Coulter as a shitty person because she's undesirable rather than, every word to come out of her mouth. And sure, you can argue, well, we don't sympathize or agree with Ruckus because it's satire. These ideas and attitudes framing women as immoral due to their undesirability never gets challenged. They're affirmed repeatedly. This is not a defense of Rice or Coulter, but instead understanding that the Boondocks relies very heavily on this type of communication. Ruckus himself is no exception. Sure, he's not a person we're necessarily meant to agree or sympathize with. But what does it say when one of the most prominent characters to represent that element of black coonery and respectability is symbolized through a character who is both dark-skinned and visibly disabled? Ruckus is the only dark-skinned character of the main cast. Let bad people be bad is overly reductive here. There's honestly quite a bit of body diversity with the character designs in the Boondocks, at least with the men and boys who can be presented with varying ages and perspectives. But that shit all goes out the window when you look at the majority of black women in the series, even when they're direct references to real people or objects of ridicule. A lot of animated TV series have this kind of pattern in character designs, where there's a lot of body diversity among the men and boys, but then the women and girls all have the same wide heads, thin bodies, hourglass waist design. You'll maybe get a few characters to deviate from that, but they'll often be women who show up for an episode at most, or there's a story-specific reason for their design to break away from that. I can point out Aunt Cookie, for example, but she plays such a small role in the grand scheme of things that it hardly means anything. The few women that break this mold have barely any screen time relative to the larger trend. Cristal, like the champagne, is assumed to be damaged goods, nothing more than a manipulative trickster because she's a sex worker. Robert genuinely cares about her, but the joke is more on him for being unaware of it, with everyone else obviously seeing that she's a sex worker. Huey also says a bunch of hoteppy shit about women in the same episode. It'd be one thing if this is something they deconstruct, but Huey is validated about all of this by the end. Robert offers to help Cristal turn her life around when she mentions that she wants to get out of the business, and protects her from her pimp who tries to beat and dehumanize her. Cristal is never given any meaningful screen time again. She's just written off as someone who is attractive, but a manipulator out to deceive you. So you have to be worried about these women. Cristal could just be a sex worker, and Robert knows that and is fine with it. Being a sex worker doesn't mean you're incapable of interacting with people in a non-business transaction way. But Huey and Riley's views that a large portion of women are manipulative hustlers after money and that sex workers are less than ultimately get validated. This ties into another problem, where women are shown to still be conventionally attractive and thus desirable, but are deceitful or wasteful with their good features. Queer, fat, disabled, and dark-skinned bodies are still seen as less than. Fatphobia, for example, often results in treating people as objects of ridicule, greedy, unhealthy, immoral, or abusive as being fat, and also plays into the same idea as seeing them as inherently undesirable. Like colorism, fatphobia also translates into social, economic, and medical violence. The police union attorney Stuart London tried to rationalize the police murder of Eric Gardner on the grounds that he was morbidly obese and would have been fine otherwise. He was a ticking time bomb that resisted arrest and would have died no matter what. Gardner was choked. He had a group of police piled on him. He was choked and had someone pressing his head down on pavement while he begged, saying he couldn't breathe several times. This was a group of cops brazenly murdering a man on camera in broad daylight that could get away with it because the person they murdered wasn't seen as human. So these attitudes do materialize into real and harmful consequences in how we dehumanize and ridicule fat bodies. Desirability also becomes one of the bigger problems with Luna, the central character and Robert's date in the episode Attack of the Killer Kung Fu Wolf Bitch. Robert is briefly dating her and gets uncomfortable when it's revealed she's a killer kung fu master. Luna kidnaps Robert and threatens to kill him, with the joke being that Luna is mentally unstable, insecure, and bitter about her history of abuse, with the episode playing the world's smallest off-key violin music to trivialize her pain, as she's recounting her mother's and her own domestic and emotional abuse, which is played entirely as a joke. It ain't pretty. Luna is continually framed as mentally unstable, but because she checks off the desirability boxes, i.e. she's a light-skinned woman with straight hair and a thin body and looks way better than the prior catfish date women we saw earlier, she's talked about in a way that she's wasting her good talents by being so bitter and held up on her past abuses.
But everything else was so right, and by everything else I mean her look, she was fine.
Many have likely recognized it already, but this is the hysterical woman trope, and more broadly an extension of Saneism. Saneism is a form of ableism that seeks to discredit, undermine, or strip agency of people on the grounds of a perceived or actual mental or cognitive disability. She's just crazy, right? If someone is mentally off in some way or even perceived to be, they must not be listened to. This can also be gendered and turned into its own form of bioessentialism. How often have we heard, "Why is she like this? It must be her time of the month." Our world has a lengthy history of stigmatizing disability, like through pathologizing and weaponizing that stigma against disabled people, in addition to other marginalized people deemed less than. It contributes to medical violence, societal alienation, institutionalization, and eugenics.
As a modern American man, I am woefully unprepared to manage a woman's emotions. I was never taught, and I will not learn.
So often in doing this, the framing of this Boondocks episode isn't even so much that Robert needs to be himself or be more honest if he wants to select better women. There's an underlying agreement that women are, by and large, inherently manipulative or mentally unstable. Robert isn't doing himself any favors by fabricating information on his dating profiles, and online dating does come with its share of dangers, sure. But while Robert isn't someone the viewer is always meant to agree or sympathize with, the entire setup and violent harm Luna causes is still predicated on the assumption that you can't trust these crazy hysterical women, especially when they have emotional baggage that gets in the way of those great features. That's also the case with nearly all of Robert's dating episodes. Women are either ugly, manipulators, or crazy, and that makes the majority of women shown here. It's an inelegant dance of Misogynoir and Ableism that's been going on for centuries. One of the other characters, Luna's friend, who talks with her on the phone, is voiced by Tichina Arnold, who has talked openly in the past about the colorism she encounters in the entertainment industry. From Martin to Everybody Hates Chris, she gets typecasted very frequently into a role of being a bitter, angry black woman. I'd even go so far as to say she's so typecasted that the Boondocks doesn't even need to physically show her character. Arnold's voice alone is enough to communicate everything we need to know about her friend. This friend gives Luna tons of bad advice and repeatedly comes up with excuses, with her catchphrase being, "See, this is exactly why I don't have a man." This also showcases a lot of the ideas that don't get properly brought into focus when talking about boys and men as victims of abuse at the hands of women and girls in media. We've all seen that situation where someone sees a very blatant case of a woman being abused and then goes, well, if it was a woman abusing a man, nobody would care. If you've ever watched Legend of Korra, do you remember Eska, Bolin's girlfriend? I use girlfriend very loosely here, but you get the idea. This is the same thing. He's abused throughout the entire second book, with it being played largely as comedic. While Bolin is the victim in this situation, the humor is predicated entirely on Eska's hysteria and mental instability. The fact that Bolin assaults Ginger in the same book doesn't even get the same focus.
The only way to deal with crazy women is to lie big and leave fast.
It's important to talk about male victims of abuse in a way that isn't trying to just silence discussions of misogyny, especially toward non-white women, because it's a conversation about the same topic too. I think something often left out of the conversation is how the abuse is taking place. Because see, we haven't even gotten to the best part about this Boondocks episode. After Luna heads back to her car in tears over everything that happened, she ends her life with an explosive, not long after with it being played as a joke. In this case, our narrative centers around a hysterical black woman, laughed at for her and her mother being victims of domestic and emotional abuse. She's merely told to quit being a victim and take responsibility for her actions, and promptly ends her own life, with it being treated as something to laugh at. That says a lot. In effect, Luna is someone who, like Cristal, was seen as damaged goods. You have all these amazing things going for you, by which I mean she's a good-looking woman with straight hair and a nice thin body. And while Robert gives her this genuine encouragement about how she's a smart, talented woman who could get any kind of man she'd ever want, it rings hollow in how her mental instability is treated as an impingement against her, and her very life is a joke when she dies and is recounting her abuse.
You ever start talking to a girl that's just too good looking? She's just too fine to not have a man, and the first thing that comes to your mind is, what's wrong with you? The dots ain't adding up. What's the diagnosis? Jan Zoloff ain't your sweetheart.
Because so often, conversations of stalking, abuse, and violence of various kinds toward male victims still become misogynistic in how the abuse is communicated, like through dark-skinned, trans, disabled, fat, and what are labeled as undesirable women. I want to be clear and point out that yes, there is room to talk about men and boys, especially when they're queer, non-white, and disabled. I'm not saying that men and boys have no space to talk about our abuse, including when women and girls, our friends and families, are perpetrators. Don't misunderstand. I'm saying that in the context of discussing this in film, television, and news, that a lot of artists and journalists have this problem of replicating their misogynistic ideas through the dynamics of the abuse they portray. Often, abusive women are made to be those same features to interlink their abuse with undesirability. Abusive women are often portrayed as fat, dark-skinned, or mentally unstable in a way that gets obscured by reducing the conversation solely to just people don't care about men as victims. Abusive women are often portrayed as fat, dark-skinned, or mentally unstable in a way that gets obscured by reducing the conversation solely to just people don't care about men as victims. It's an insidious technique that allows cis men to perpetuate violence and oppression toward women while maintaining a victim status for ourselves. Patriarchy breeds oppressive evaluation, hatred, and mistrust. You can't trust what we're told are ugly women because they're worthless and undesirable, but you can't trust what we're told are beautiful women either, because it's a little too suspicious that she's single. She could be crazy or a manipulative sex worker trying to scam you. What does it say when the Boondocks links that wickedness and hostility with undesirability, as is the case with Mistress Leevil, who was based on Deborah Lee and Dr. Evil? What does it say when there's literally just a character named Crazy Bitch? What does it say when there's an entire episode about Ebony Brown, who is the embodiment of the perfect black woman, and it imagines her with a thin body, straight hair, light skin, and is able to chuckle off even the most venomous hostility and misogynoir sent her way? In fact, she's so desirable that even someone like Ruckus, who is nothing but disdainful toward black women and specifically mistrusted her and insulted her to her face, can't help but fall in love with her too.
No batshit crazy women, please.
What does it say that a character like Jasmine, who was very much born out of the experiences of Angela Nissel, is basically Huey's naive friend in the show proper? Cindy and Sarah are white, so I get them not having as much focus. There is an important topic to discuss with Sarah, one I haven't really seen much in Boondocks discourse, but I'll save that for the Booty Warrior section. So short answer again is yes, hire black women, hire black disabled people, hire black queer people. But I'm also a believer in naming these issues directly and challenging the attitudes of the people who hold them. It won't do any good to bring knowledgeable talent onto a project if there's going to be so much resistance and pushback that they're kicked off for being too difficult, as has happened countless times now. These attitudes don't exist in isolation. Take some commentary from the Season 2 DVD box set with some of the showrunners talking about the criticisms they've received.
She was.
Yeah.
I wish she was.
Well, it's kind of like when I get the criticism, why aren't there any black women in the show? And I always tell black women, well, you don't really want them there.
No, fuck no.
Because we're not gonna be nice. We're not right. You don't really want to be in the show.
None of us would get any pussy if they were black women of the show. None. I know I wouldn't.
Only person to discover their roots, you know.
Because if you think black men don't have a sense of humor, woo, shit. Just think, instead of saying nigga, we said bitch.
Oh man.
I don't follow you.
But it's like the nigga moment. Like everyone, you know, we caught a lot of flack for, you know what I'm saying, showing niggas respond in situations like that. But the truth is,
there are black people.
But then you get
right now, while we're doing this, there are black people in front of a liquor store fighting.
Right
as
now.
we speak. It's on the first 48.
Over 25 cents.
Right, and they're fighting.
Over a quarter.
Right, yeah, and they're fighting. Somebody may die. But see, to talk about that isn't positive. You shouldn't. We're supposed to ignore that.
We're supposed to call them African kings.
Yeah.
Right. These two African kings.
It's a positive.
Shot each other over a nickel.
Right, with 40 ounces in their hand.
None of us would get any pussy. That is some wild shit to say. The issue isn't really about making individual black women necessarily nice or perfect people. Positivity was never the issue. Black women deserve to also be depicted as flawed, multi-layered people with their own struggles, emotional challenges, and to be seen as complex humans too. Framing the issue as just we're not going to be nice sidesteps the underlying issue of how misogynoir dictates what women are seen as human. It's not about presenting women as perfect individuals, but to understand how we as black men have internalized these ideas of black women and uncritically translate it into our own beliefs. It comes out loud and clear in your own work, dog. Instead, they dismissed a valid critique of something that was broadcast to millions of people and is still referenced and influential to this day. This is what I mean when I say these guys don't exist in isolation, because the kind of black artists who have access to a very limited, very inaccessible space in the film and TV industry often come from backgrounds that give them more space to cater in some way to white supremacist attitudes. Misogynoir goes alongside queerphobia in how it shapes their perception of desirability. And with that, we can better understand a lot of the storytelling pitfalls. Men in this art space often have objectifying views of women, and it translates into their work when they also have control who is in their artistic space to challenge them. And artists like Drake and his Colorism, Donald Glover and his Misogynoir, and the showrunners behind the Boondocks are able to project their views of black women, of queer and fat bodies, and of dark-skinned people into their work unchallenged. The entertainment industry is designed to welcome such people, provided they generate profit and maintain the status quo. Women are expected to meet the standards of being sexualized, but never enjoy or participate in their own sexuality, because they're seen as property and never autonomous people. Even supposed pro-black people are not exempt from this. Black liberation for them is less a call to dismantle white supremacy, and more to tame and mold it to better serve them. I want you to keep these things in mind as we go over an episode I feel is often discussed in an incomplete way.
Everything went wrong, just like everything went right. Everything went wrong when I put on that dress.
I want to make something clear up front. I don't give a fuck about Tyler Perry. Let me reiterate, don't give a fuck. He's anti-union and continually displays a lack of respect for people's talents in the way that he talks about other writers and their inclusions. He has no degree of introspection in the limitations towards the quality and stereotypes perpetuated by his own work. The same way goes for the way he talks about AI in the industry to work around proper compensation. Many of his works normalize abuse of various forms, especially in how it appeals to beating children as discipline in spite of the overwhelming evidence showing the harm it causes. His work stigmatizes those with STDs and engages in the very same homophobia the Boondocks engages in. When it's not that, it's the colorism, the fatphobia and ableism, his horrible portrayal of sexual violence. And dude's work is just corny. And don't get me wrong, I'm down for watching bad TV shows. With Tyler Perry, expect some silly writing, silly acting, and some silly shit. So at no point are we in any way going to be offended on behalf of or concerned about Tyler Perry. There's quite a few reasons to dislike and mock the man, but we're here to discuss what the Boondocks chooses to focus on in its framing. Because at the same time, the overwhelming narrative surrounding the episode Pause focuses on the spectacle of how deeply offended and outraged Tyler Perry was about this. And the aspect of how unbelievably queerphobic this episode is rarely comes into play, except to contribute to that impingement against Tyler Perry, based on literally any comment section. It's as popular as it is specifically because it's so queerphobic. If you jumped ahead to this section, I suggest going back and watching the section about desirability right before this. A lot of this section assumes that you have. Pause aired in 2010, and the 2010s was also a time period that saw a major rise in trans visibility within the mainstream media landscape. That's also why we see so much transphobic comedy ramp up around this time too, as policy-making decisions centered around trans panic. That's not to say that things started here or that these problems were not here before. God knows the 2000s was full of this shit too. Only to say that it was more on people's minds and more showrunners were including their bigotries, intentional or not, into their work in more specific ways. Tyler Perry's in this odd situation because he's also one of the largest black media figures at the time, and the straights have a bunch of queerphobic hangups tied to the black man in a dress trope, which we'll get into more detail over in a moment. Tyler Perry finds himself an easy target and the center of a lot of queerphobic conspiracy theories, like him secretly being gay or trans, or that he contributes to the erroneous idea of the emasculation of black men, that believes that Hollywood is out to feminize black men and put us in dresses because something, because Hollywood is apparently afraid of masculine men, even though hyper-masculinization is a core part of dehumanizing black men and has for centuries. Whether Tyler Perry is queer or not is not our concern. The Freeman family is in the middle of watching a Madux film, a parody of Tyler Perry's Medea. Robert decides to try out for a role for Winston Jerome, aka Tyler Perry. Huey points out that Robert is out of his element because he's both old and a terrible actor. Robert auditions and gets casted, not for his acting skills, but because Winston is clearly putting out his casting requirements as a dating listing and wants to sleep with Robert. Tyler Perry likes surrounding himself with muscular, shirtless, oiled up men and is clearly trying to sexually pursue Robert. Robert joins the cast, and Winston, who isolates Robert from his family, keeps him at his compound, because it's, in their words, a homoerotic Christian theater cult. The plot focuses around Tyler Perry's attempts to prey on Robert and isolate him from his family, who sees that he's supposedly being brainwashed. They save him as Medea and Robert's character nearly kiss during rehearsal. Tyler repeatedly claims to do things under the word of Jesus. The episode constantly pokes fun at this dissonance between the Christian themes his story supposedly represents and the queerness he exudes. In short, it's clear that he's just using God as an excuse to hide his depraved queer attraction to men. Robert is strung along through the play on the promise of beautiful women. We see several thin, straight-haired women throughout the episode presented as the desirable people he wants dangled above his head, quite literally in some scenes, because Winston Jerome's assistant is presented as the kind of desirable woman Robert is seeking, and is constantly dangled in front of him. They act as a constant narrative reminder of the kind of people he's doing this all for. But no, he's been deceived by the dude in the dress, the one who, in his words, believes he has to become a woman, both inside and out, to convincingly play the part at the instruction of Jesus. There's a prayer scene that, according to Carl Jones, was based off of Gary Anthony Williams' audition time for Tyler Perry work. Huey and Riley warn Robert that he's been trapped in a cult, with a reveal that Robert is fully aware that it's a cult. He admits that he's willing to take his chances with it, and is even willing to kiss a man for a chance at making a break in Hollywood, comparing the idea of kissing a man to the disgusting challenges of consuming animal parts and fluids from Fear Factor. He ultimately wants fame and fortune, and specifically focuses on sexual gratification from beautiful women. The episode ends with him going through with the play and doing the kiss scene, only to see that his groupies are a bunch of fat women. Winston then reveals his intentions and begs Robert for sex, admitting that he made up the whole Christian cult as an excuse to sleep with men. Robert tells him to fuck off and shamefully drives home with his fat groupie. Riley replays the kiss scene he recorded while saying, "Pause, Granddad." The humor is built around the contradiction of someone being queer while upholding the tenets of conservative Christianity. The episode pokes fun at Tyler's bad writing, the poorly implemented themes of Christianity, and even the colorism of his work, which, by the way, is pretty goddamn bold coming from this show when it does the same thing. But it also relies on homophobic and transphobic beliefs black comedians have held up in years prior, and how it demonizes Winston Jerome as a predatory, depraved gay man or trans woman trying to manipulate or trick straight men into sex. Before we go any further, I'd like to address this idea of viewing this episode through a trans lens now, because this idea gets a lot of misconception. I am not saying that Tyler Perry himself is a trans woman, or even necessarily that the writers intentionally wrote him to be one. A lot of times when looking at works that lean into transphobic narratives, but explicitly tell us that these are not trans people, it's common for people to call it open and shut from that alone. But the reason these, for lack of a better word, trans-adjacent or trans-coded characters can still be read with a trans lens is that the average cis person doesn't actually know what being trans is, often conflating it with cross-dressing or worse, mental illness, and often that misunderstanding can be done maliciously. For instance, The Simpsons features an episode in which Patty, Marge's lesbian sister, is getting married, only to discover that the woman she was going to marry, we're explicitly told, is a cis man. She merely dresses as a woman because she's a professional golfer and participates in women's sports to gain an advantage. If the man infiltrating women's sports thing didn't set off alarms already, it should when you consider that this is a loose interpretation of Mayim Bagger, an openly trans golfer who was far more in the public conscious at the time this episode was produced and aired. Just concluding that there's no trans stuff because Veronica says she's a man at the end leaves most of the discussion points on the table. This is also why cases where if we're explicitly told a character is cis, it doesn't mean they can't be utilized to discuss trans-related issues. This is why characters that still utilize storytelling elements that directly affect the experiences of trans people, even if the character is not explicitly stated to be trans, conversations get stuck on staying within the confines of the media's universe. Naoto Shirogane in Persona 4 Golden is explicitly stated to be a girl, but leaving it there excludes the queer antagonism present in both her character and in Kanji's. The game utilizes what are very blatant queer elements, and how Kanji can be read as questioning and Naoto transmasculine, even if you play that secret ending that recontextualizes the nature of the Midnight Champ. There's nothing wrong with portraying Kanji being into what are seen as feminine activities without being queer, or Naoto dealing with sexism in a vacuum. But the problem is the way the game flirts with the idea of both of them being queer, and framing them as having grown or being normal in the way that they are explicitly not these queer identities that the Persona series regularly antagonizes. Even taking it at face value, as a story about navigating sexism and how Naoto feels she can't exist in a male-dominated field, this is still coming from the same game that repeatedly sexualizes Naoto and puts her in situations they don't consent to, where her body is put on display and grabbed by her whole friend group. Naoto's portrayal is full of problems even if you chose to just read it at face value and see her as a cis girl. Like, really? Her supposedly supportive friend group gropes her, outs her medical information, and forces her into a pageant with a swimsuit contest she didn't consent to, while drawing so much attention to her body in ways she's deeply uncomfortable with? These are all comedic moments. That's our story about dealing with sexism, folks. This also gets further complicated with the prevalence of censorship of queer characters, or when writers intentionally obscure that they're talking about a trans character, but have to design it in a way that will let their work actually get published. It also applies with translated works, where localizers opt to not include details in the original work on the grounds of either ignorance or not wanting to upset the general public at the existence of a trans person. Like with Vivian always being unambiguously a trans woman in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. She could literally say, "I am a trans woman." Mario could prescribe her hormones, and she glides off into the sunset riding through Rainbow Road, and you would still have people denying it. This is a common talking point with cross-dressers, especially since a common transphobic sentiment to imagine trans people as just confused, mentally ill gay people. So when I say the character Winston Jerome is trans-adjacent, I know that Tyler Perry isn't secretly a trans woman. I'm saying that the Boondocks has constructed a misogynistic caricature through which they ridicule Winston Jerome in ungendering him and mocking his perceived queerness. So as we continue analyzing things, keep these details in mind. Back to the episode, there's a section of Huey summarizing the plot of Diary of a Mad Black Woman, while making fun of how bad it was. It's easily the best and most effective satirical moment of the entire episode. In fact, it's so good, and basically a whole aside disconnected from the rest of the episode, that it feels like they wrote this portion first and built the rest of the plot around it after trying to find how to take shots at Tyler Perry. A handful of these season 3 episodes fit this kind of mold, where it feels like there's one section where Huey just says something political or insightful, and then the rest of the episode is just completely detached from that moment. It makes the writing feel rushed and disjointed from the rest of the episode. And don't get me wrong, I think season 1 is a bit overrated, even if it has some standout episodes. But I also think Season 3 is an interesting case, because I think it has a significant drop in the quality of its episodes, but I mostly attribute that to the consequences of the exploitation of the industry that then led to the strikes, which then led to delays and new constraints. But in this episode, we have pause and no homo jokes abound. Winston Jerome's character directly references Rocky Picture Horror Show, particularly Dr. Frankenfurter, aka the textbook definition of the queer, sexually depraved villain. And the episode's framing is entirely built around gay and trans-panic rhetoric. Rocky Picture Horror Show has had no end of queer analyses because of what it represents to people within queer spaces, both positive and negative aspects. I'm not here to discuss the movie itself, only to establish the overwhelming amount of queerness that becomes interlinked with Winston Jerome and how extensively Rocky Picture becomes referenced in this episode. People don't just say pause in response to any sex act, but it's done in the specific way that they are afraid they'll be perceived as queer, and jokingly or intentionally say pause to reassert their normal status. Tyler Perry is not a victim of transphobia here, but what we are seeing is a caricaturized way of ungendering him through years of trans-misogynistic sentiments in demonization of trans bodies. In one scene, Boondocks is sticking their tongue out and preparing to kiss Robert, who's closing his eyes in preparation, while wincing in disgust and apprehension. The framing of the shot exaggerates Boondocks' face to highlight the element of disgust, a trend you'll notice in a lot of other works of black men in dresses doing their best minstrel performances. I know one of the most common responses when this comes up. You obviously missed the point because we're not meant to agree with Robert and Riley. They're making fun of homophobic attitudes. Robert is a womanizer, so of course he's being punished. Do you need media to tell you that bad people are bad? That line of thinking, seeing Robert as a womanizer getting what's coming to him, isn't incorrect, but it is incomplete. Pause is a long joke at Robert's expense, with him getting his comeuppance for trying to be a womanizing creep who thinks he deserves to be treated better than everyone. This line comes up a lot with adult animation and satires with, oh, well, they're supposed to be awful, which doesn't get into the heart of the issue. Depiction is not endorsement, but framing absolutely is. The question of how the show communicates they're being wrong is important as well. Leaving this as just let bad people be bad oversimplifies the conflict. In the story of Gangstalicious Part 2, we see several of these cishet characters reacting with disgust toward the idea of being queer. But that idea is at their expense in a way that still reaffirms the queerness of Gangstalicious, as the episode's main focus is how their behavior causes harm to him. He hasn't done anything to warrant this behavior from them, and it's harmful and dangerous, with him ultimately not even coming out by the end and staying silent to maintain plausible deniability. Robert makes a genuine effort to challenge the way he thinks about masculinity and accept his grandson. Even though Riley is not gay, it's still an important moment for Robert to rethink his prior assumptions about black masculinity and sexuality. While it does feature homophobic characters, there's still an assertion of characters highlighting the circumstances that contribute to why they're acting that way, and we're ultimately meant to see it as a means to do self-examination, and see something as harmful in society. The climactic scenes in the episode are framed in such a way that place emphasis on the harm caused toward Gangstalicious, as well as the honesty from Robert. Going back to pause, we're meant to see Robert as a lecherous creep and in the wrong because he's not a good actor. He's doing this for his own selfish gain, wanting preferential treatment and women. But the problem is that the episode may be a joke at Robert's expense, but it's also at the expense of fat and queer bodies too. Something that sticks out to me is that even in critiquing misogynistic behavior and attitudes, the often cis men don't imagine a solution that actually challenges the underlying behavior, and instead punishes the womanizing character by acting in a way still within that cis-heteronormative framework, by punishing them with violence, affection, or some kind of sexual attention from a fat person, a crossdresser, a trans woman, someone or something the author views as so disgusting that it scares the womanizer from that behavior. Likewise, Robert is also being punished for his behavior by the world seeing him as a queer man, since he kissed a dude in a dress, with the episode ending on Riley saying pause and repeatedly replaying the footage he bootlegged of the kiss scene between Robert and Winston. This isn't like Gangstalicious, where this is a black queer man hiding his queerness to avoid the bigotries of those around him, and the episode highlighting the problems of those around him and the harm it causes. This is an instance of us agreeing with the disgust the cast shows toward the concept of being perceived as queer. The idea is never challenged within the episode, and while the joke comes at Robert's expense in the end for thinking he's a good actor, it's still done in a way that reaffirms those bigotries toward black, gay, and trans people for the audience. The narrative asserts that only thin, white, and light-skinned women with straight hair are desirable, and that fat women are disgusting and worthless, thus making them a fitting punishment for the sleazy protagonist who dare to desire the real prize. That's why they use a common anime trope to highlight the disgust we're meant to feel toward them and laugh at Robert for being stuck with them. And often, those attitudes all blur together in a way that ultimately come back to the same source, trans-misogynoir. The Boondocks is hardly the only show to engage in this kind of narrative. Take the massage sketch from In Living Color and Wanda, who is portrayed by Jamie Foxx. The joke with Wanda is pretty much the same each time. She's viewed as disgusting, ugly, and unfeminine in contrast to a more conventionally attractive woman, with Jamie Foxx making the most exaggerated faces. A womanizing dude is sexually harassing the lighter-skinned massage therapist, so she switches out with Wanda, who starts the massage. The build-up to the shocking, disgusting reveal is the source of most of the humor, since the guy doesn't see what Wanda looks like. You could definitely make the claim that this is a satirical joke at a womanizer's expense, and it's not technically wrong. But it leaves out how the narrative communicates the way he is wrong by treating a minstrel caricature of a black woman, her dark skin, masculine features, and big body, as a punishment. It's not a challenge of misogynoir or defense of black women. It further entrenches the problems. And the sketch is ultimately the same joke each time with Wanda. She's viewed with disgust by everyone around her, while she's confident and doesn't recognize how ugly she is in contrast to the women around her. While the joke may be on the men Wanda gets with, Wanda herself is also the target of the joke in what the sketches communicate about dark-skinned black women through the years of minstrel caricatures. My Wife and Kids has Toni Fogel, Michael's high school classmate who is a trans woman. She's a transphobic joke that relies on the exact same concept. Michael wants to be distanced from her with the reveal that all the sports stuff he did with Toni was more homoerotic than he realized, and he doesn't want to be perceived as gay because he sees her as a nasty gay man. Scary Movie had both Ray, a closeted gay stereotype, and the unsubtly named Miss Man, who was a predatory man pretending to be a woman, so she could be a girls' sports coach and spy on the underage girls and do other inappropriate things with them, which is straight out of the Trans Panic Handbook. One of Atlanta's earliest episodes has a man who is dating who I assume is a trans woman labeled a gay man. While the protagonist does not mock him, instead uncomfortably staying out of the conversation, we still see him talk about open-mindedness because he still accepted the premise that she is in fact a man and that he's gay.
My nigga, that's a man. What? No, it's my ex. Your ex-girlfriend a man. Why you think she in jail with the men? She'd be on the other side. Nigga, you gay. Nah, I mean, she... So you think I'm gay?
Sexuality is a spectrum. You can really do whatever you want.
Leaving the conversation at if womanizers are bad people leaves out the way that so often the narrative is framed in a way where you can only see them as getting punished if you see dark-skinned, fat, and trans bodies as inherently disgusting.
And all I get is them mud ducks out there?
Family Guy did it with Ida Quagmire sleeping with Brian and him vomiting at the realization that she's trans. It's further affirmed by the actual feelings of the showrunners discussing the episode after the fact. The Cleveland Show did it with what was essentially a Medea parody of their own in Auntie Mama. One Piece did it, Persona 3 did it, Persona 4 does it with fat women, In Living Color did it, Atlanta did it, and yes, the Boondocks does it too. Winston Jerome is characterized and framed as a predatory gay man, the dude in a dress who nonetheless pretends to be a woman, both in how he cross-dresses and also in how he acts as a woman inside and out, in his own words. The only difference between the Boondocks and other gay and trans panic episodes is that Robert is already fully aware of the queerness from the start, but is willing to bite the bullet for the fame and gratification he desires. But that disgust is still made present in how Robert draws the comparison of kissing another man to that of the disgust challenges from Fear Factor. I don't think it's a reach to view this in a trans lens and Winston as a trans-adjacent character, considering the multiple uses of transphobic slurs and repeated narratives throughout the show in episodes both before and after this one that go unchallenged.
And I ain't talking about them super steroided she-males in the Olympics that tuck their testicles up either.
The entire premise of Pause is reliant on imagining Tyler Perry less as a bad writer or a problem to examine, but instead a predatory queer body, be it a gay man or a trans woman attempting to deceive a straight man into satisfying his depraved urges. The Rocky Picture Horror Show references, the way the show constantly makes the pause and no homo jokes, and the element of Robert's disgust all further support this. This is not a defense of Tyler Perry's work. There are numerous valid things to critique about his writing, about his beliefs, and his business practices. But his queer identity or perceived queerness is not an indicator of that behavior, and the Boondocks draws on years of trans-misogynistic attitudes to mock him. Hollywood has had a lengthy history of performing minstrelsy in various forms, transitioned into animation, and invoked a very narrow set of tropes toward black women, which you can see made apparent in TV shows like The Beulah Show and Julia. But over time, the same ideas and stereotypes of black women, the mammy, the Jezebel, and the Sapphire still endure. But restrictions in broadcasting and what is considered allowable causes the exact tropes and narratives to evolve with time as well. We want to keep perpetuating this image of black women, and the black man in a dress trope became born from this idea. Because really think about how the trope is used most of the time in a way to make a modernized minstrel, right? It allows you to efficiently hyper-exaggerate this idea of black women as inherently masculine. It relies on a bodysuit to perpetuate fatphobia. It's a black man performing comedic cross-dressing, which allows for homophobic and transphobic attitudes to come about in that read as well. Fatphobia and transphobia are ideas constructed through white supremacy, and have centuries of influence in shaping our understanding of medicine in the US. It's one of the main ways through which eugenics takes root as well. So because media is largely controlled by those with a vested interest in perpetuating white supremacy, the kind of black men allowed in the space are the ones willing to derogate black women, perpetuate queer and fatphobia, and basically become the modern minstrel. This lack of concern for black women and anyone that isn't able-bodied cis-het black men creates a paradox. They're willing to play the part of a modern minstrel, but don't want to be perceived as queer themselves, because they can't reconcile that with their pursuit of hypermasculinity imposed onto them by white supremacy. They instead opt to construct a conspiracy theory that black men are the victims of a mass emasculation plot, rather than saying that Hollywood profits from demeaning and propagandizing about black people and is using them as a puppet to that end. Brandon Jackson talks about how wearing the dress ruined his life. He talks about queerness or even being queer adjacent, as if it is a betrayal of his very blackness. He shies away from being perceived as queer, not about being used as a puppet for a white supremacist. His personal life was apparently in shambles because of his perception and fear. He rightfully identifies a structural unfairness toward black people in Hollywood, but rather than just naming the problem, which is racism, gendered inequality, ableism, or whatever, it's the conspiracy to take the black man down with making people think they could be gay. Our society takes every chance it can get to view black men and boys as hypermasculine, as a way to justify adultifying, dehumanizing, and killing us. So why for 1 second would there be a fear to prevent that in Hollywood? Why would that be such a great threat if they openly employ it? Men like this in Hollywood are the people we mostly have when talking about representation and access.
I think the dress, personally, is a thing that is not in our culture to do. And I think everybody will want to put their culture on us.
We know what you really mean when you say culture. Maybe it's not that Hollywood had some conspiracy theory to get you turned gay, and more that Big Mama was just a shitty set of movies, dog. He even admitted that they weren't the best himself. The biggest lie behind the whole emasculation of black men talking point is that nobody is going to see you as queer, unfeminine, or even emasculated for what you're doing. Performing minstrelsy at the expense of black women does not feminize these men in the slightest. It's quite the opposite, because they're seen as so mannish, so masculine, because their masculinity is used to derogate black, usually dark-skinned women, with their bodies being used to represent the man-like, undesirable features of black women white supremacy relies on. Black men performing minstrelsy at the expense of black women will only be seen as masculine, because that's how bigots see the black women they're mocking. It's a minstrelsy that's rooted in trans-misogynoir, which in turn also ungenders black women, engages in colorism at the expense of dark-skinned black people, invokes the fatphobia dating back centuries, and texturism and featureism all at once. Take the case of Eddie Murphy and Shalimar Seuli, a trans sex worker Murphy led into his car. The narrative centered around mockery at the expense of Eddie Murphy, even being parodied in various media, rather than taking seriously what Seuli was going through, the power Murphy held in that situation, and the involvement of the police.
You don't understand, officer. I thought that king was the queen.
Out of 130 women who responded to Dad, these women are our 6 finalists.
If they really are women. I just don't want Dad to get caught out there like Eddie Murphy.
What we're seeing is a play on cis-heteronormative views of desirability of women, which is why so often trans women or any trans femme individuals are portrayed as just gay men who are cross-dressing, that they are deceptive and manipulative in their pursuit of straight men, all of which is a rolled up heap of trans misogyny. There's a variety of portrayals of trans people you could have, like trans men, people outside the gender binary, a or bigender or gender fluid people too. This is also why so often trans men or trans masculine individuals, like the case of Ron Griffin, are presented as tragic or failures of undesirability. So sure, the Boondocks is full of characters we're not necessarily meant to agree with or find sympathetic, but that doesn't change the way that the cast routinely espouses bigoted views for the audience to either laugh at because they go unchallenged, or requires the audience to agree with, as is the case with Robert being stuck with a fat woman after being viewed as a gay man for the whole world to laugh at him. It ends up splashing together a bunch of different types of bigotries in a way that's less challenged because it's minstrelsy performed by black actors. And cross-dressing doesn't have to be that, which comes back to framing. There's also a history of cross-dressing and drag within the queer community as a way of exploring and complicating gender identity. So it's not to say there's no place for it, but to say that the average cis-het person isn't aware or concerned about it. You'll often see that a lot of transphobic scenes don't technically feature trans characters, but have trans-adjacent characters reliant on either just a refusal to acknowledge transness accurately, or ignorance on the part of the creator as to what being transgender actually means. As a result, you'll have instances of characters who will explicitly be cis dudes in woman disguises, only for the show to replicate the exact talking points weaponized against trans people in real life. The same men that talk about themselves and other black men like this don't give a shit about black women. Michael Chi was trying to make the claim that he was hacked when he made essay jokes about Simone Biles. The concern ends at what affects him. This translates into very real violence, especially toward black queer and specifically black trans individuals, and then has blame shifted onto people, which is the primary basis behind gay and trans panic rhetoric, and why it is treated as normal to murder black queer people. These jokes are predicated on the normalization of black queer violence, and reaffirms white supremacist narratives about black people as a whole. Neither the pursuit of being masculine black men, nor the dehumanization of black bodies exist in isolation.
You watched it?
I've seen it, yeah. Uncomfortably, I watched it, yeah.
Okay.
Before we start, this is going to be a section discussing and showing scenes of rape and sexual violence. I know there was a content warning at the start, but I want to give an extra warning for this part in case you want to skip this. Completely understand. I'll give a moment for viewers to move the timer if they don't want to watch this portion. If you haven't gotten up, go stretch a bit. Drink some water if you haven't. So we can talk about the Booty Warrior episode, but I don't really feel the direct problem needs a lengthy explanation. You can already guess the problem based on the subject alone. Prison rape jokes are not funny. You can call me soft or whatever, but it doesn't change how the series relies on rape as comedy and the ways it's used to reinforce ideas of desirability and fear of the black or queer other. There are a few things I think are worth touching on, right from the opening scene, which is a parody of To Catch a Predator, a TV show hosted by Chris Hansen. You could make a compelling episode about how crime-based shows like To Catch a Predator and Lock Up Raw, the show that aided in popularizing the image of the Booty Warrior, have zero sense of integrity, and instead lean into that framing and perpetuating many of the same ideas we have about mass incarceration and SV. But the Boondocks is not doing that. This would be an especially important discussion with the prevalence of true crime media, like we saw with the handling of Jeffrey Dahmer. But the Boondocks instead opts to contribute to that same stigma itself. Ending the opening scene on Chris Hansen, or as he's called and made into a meme about, Chris Handsome, getting raped for a laugh is certainly, a choice. But this is where the whole line from Fleece Johnson, taken from Lock Up Raw, comes from.
So you got a bunch of men locked up in one place. All of them get hard. All of them's horny. All of them got sexual desire. So what are they gonna do? You won't let them have a woman. They gonna have each of somebody's gonna have to give us some booty. And it's just that simple. I'm telling you what. I like you and I want you. And we can do it the easy way or the hard way. So the choice is yours, right?
Even setting aside the fact that this is not just a rape scene, but a rape scene making comedy out of rape between two real people, I think it says a lot that this scene is largely memed about and was born in the first place out of how Fleece Johnson talks, much like how people with accents or those considered poor, often dark-skinned black people is inherently funny for the audience to laugh at. and derives memes from that despite the very blatant seriousness of what's being discussed. Chris Hansen even mentions how uncomfortably I watched it, and Vlad TV decides to make a whole bit out of him sitting, as Carl Jones does the voice and jokes about how he's gonna come and rape Chris, when it was announced that the real Fleece Johnson is out of prison. That video at time of writing has over 300,000 views. Really think about how we're just sitting and watching an interview of a man watching a cartoon version of him getting raped by an actual man for a comedic effect. What's more, another channel has made a space branding itself around being a voice, platform, and realistically making a spectacle and profit from the attention generated by the commodification and memification of Fleece Johnson. These lines, the Booty Warrior lines, Fleece Johnson's words, have become commodities. It's like a photocopy of a photocopy at this point. I don't know what layer of capitalistic hell we're in where rape reaches that level of commodification. Almost every mention of the Booty Warrior has this laughing emoji. In fact, in looking up things about Diddy and SA in media, it's honestly eerie how much you see this specific emoji littered throughout the comments section. Just a mention of Diddy's name, or the idea of being a victim of his SA, is framed as comedic, and is now sprinkled in several meme videos in comedic art. The rest of the Boondocks episode is basically this. It's almost entirely rape jokes. There's also a bit of a pattern based on what we see in Pause, and there's that one genuine moment of Huey saying something somewhat insightful or satirical about the topic, but then it's back to business as we go back to rape comedy. On that note, I want to help build my case on how the Boondocks utilizes SV within its narrative, looking at one of its main characters. The prosecution calls its next witness, Mr. Tom Dubois. Tom is a fascinating case study when you look at the way the Boondocks throughout its lifespan gradually shifts its focus toward the adults from what was generally its emotional center. It's focused on the perspectives of children too young to fully grasp the full scope of the way race has shaped their lives. Tom is something of a do-nothing liberal that is at best too naive to challenge the institutions around him that he directly supports. His name, Tom Dubois, is a blend of the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois. He's a prosecutor that supports the very prison industrial complex he fears. He only dates white women. He tries to erase and tame his daughter Jasmine's textured hair. There's a subplot in the comics where he has an argument with his wife over her refusal to vote for a Democrat in office. Sarah herself isn't really that important a character in the series, and largely orbits around her husband and daughter. She's a performative white liberal who is disillusioned with the Democratic Party, but not enough to go along with Huey trying to sell her on anti-capitalism. However, Tom's transition to TV also brings several moments that disrupt this portrayal. While he's by no means a black radical, Tom is often framed as a voice of reason in contrast to the others. Framing is important to effective satire, so when you make works where the main characters are intentionally awful people, how you frame the issue is everything in what you're saying. He's still a prosecutor, but his debut episode is him prosecuting R. Kelly. He's naive at worst, but largely correct and frustrated over how much overwhelming evidence he has that thoroughly made his case. The fact that he has a white wife even gets used against him, even though it has no relevance to the case. R. Kelly did it. The actual R. Kelly team did this in framing the accusations toward him as a public lynching of a black man, by the way. But the fact still remains that this portrayal of Tom takes him out of the status quo defender role and how he is portrayed. We also see multiple instances where Tom is shown to be a queer rights advocate and often provides legal advice to the Freemans when they need it. Even when Thugnificent shows up in an episode about racial dynamics in a white suburb, and Tom's knee-jerk reaction is that he would sell his house if he thought it'd still be worth anything, he also doesn't put up a fight and ends up befriending the Lethal Interjection crew quite quickly. Tom is one of the only characters to ever speak in defense of black women, and one of the only characters to regularly challenge homophobia and the use of homophobic slurs like he does with Riley. He refuses to work with people like Pretty Boy Flizzy and a pimp named Slickback because they abuse women. The narrative instead has to force them into working together. There are several episodes that present Tom as a more reasonable voice, usually in contrast to Robert, Ruckus, and Riley's nonsense, especially when pretty much nobody else brings up these kinds of points except for Tom. Tom being the primary and often only vocal force speaking in favor of or in defense of black women and queer people is important to consider with how numerous episodes participate in the constant humiliation and emasculation of Tom Dubois. In Tom, Sarah, and Usher, Tom gets humiliated by his wife's attraction to Usher, with him getting kicked out of the house after they have an argument. That line from the waiter voiced by Carl Jones saying, "Wouldn't let that shit happen to me though," is a meta joke, because the whole scene actually happened to Carl with his ex. We also have that same conversation about desirability coming up in discussing Tom's relationship with his wife, Sarah. Sarah's whole thing in the TV show is that she is shown to be unsatisfied with Tom, and instead drawn to more assertive, powerful, and competent black men like Usher, Barack Obama, or Pretty Boy Flizzy. I hate using this word, but the show likes to cuckold Tom. I don't think I've seen anyone in all the research I've done point out how fucked up the joke scene in Stinkmeaner Strikes Back is. The one where Stinkmeaner controls Tom's body to sleep with Sarah, and she's a victim of rape by deception. If someone knows of anyone who has discussed this, please share it with me. What's more, it's just presented as this great thing for her, because Stinkmeaner gave her what Tom never could. It's presented as a humorous form of humiliation at Tom's expense, despite Sarah being a victim. So it's twofold messed up in how the show presents a woman who checks all the desirability boxes as almost too much for Tom. In a way that's like, well, of course she's looking around because he belongs at Weenie Hut Juniors. But also in how Sarah is a rape victim and the show never recognizes it. Body swap and possession plots can sometimes run into problems where, for comedic purposes, they end up depicting a form of rape by deception or assault. How many times have we had body swap into a woman or girl's body and the dude immediately starts grabbing her while in her body without her consent? But it can also manifest in sex scenes, much like the Boondocks, where someone has what they think is consensual sex with their partner, not knowing someone else entirely is possessing them, and the humor in those scenes explicitly leaning in on that deception.
You steer when you're pure spirit.
Hey, I can look at myself naked.
Oh, brother. Yeah, what do you want to do with this body?
A Date with the Health Inspector discusses the US response to handling Iraq and the imperialist interests of the Bush administration. It contrasts the treatment of Swana people with the prison industrial complex and how police exist to brutalize black people and many others. You know that known knowns line from Gin Rummy?
There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
This episode has a lot to say. The Boondocks went all in when it came to being openly critical of the Bush administration, both during the comics and the TV adaptation. I can't overstate just how bold it was to be this openly critical about many of the imperialist sentiments surrounding 9/11 and the Bush administration's response to it. But it's also harder to sing its praises about how it critiques the US government when so much of the health inspector's more comedic moments are also centered around prison rape as humor, and as the starting point for playing into the constant emasculation and humiliation of Tom Dubois. This is not a problem exclusive to the Boondocks, as SV has been a mainstay in the media landscape. But SV, particularly when it's depicted with a male victim, has had a lot of conversations about desirability that come into play when looking at the various ways it's shown. Often, scenes depicting or discussing SV are not interested in centering the experience of the victim. Instead, it's seen as a way to humiliate men or devalue them as weak, because only a pathetic man would ever allow something like that happen to him, or that women become masculinized and turn into rapists. Homer Simpson from The Simpsons was raped at least 3 times that I'm aware of, one of those times coming from his wife Marge. She'd been using steroids at the time, and the joke is now that she's the man and emasculates Homer and rapes him with it played as a joke. It's also often used as an approximation to queerness, as a way of communicating that being raped makes a man queer, and thus is emasculating on that grounds alone. It also plays into the idea that prison rape specifically is a form of queerness that turns men gay, and thus being gay is a choice.
People have no control over their race, for instance.
You think they have control over their sexuality?
Absolutely.
You think being gay is a choice?
Absolutely.
Why do you say that?
Because a lot of people who go into prison straight, and when they come out, they're gay. So did something happen while they were in there?
Most
Ask yourself
gay
that
people
question.
never go to prison, and you know there's a whole theory of dominance.
Wait a minute, I said a lot of people who go in, come out. Are you denying that that's true?
This is a big part of why SV, as shown with the likes of Diddy, is just seen as something trivial to joke about or a conspiratorial takedown attempt against it. Because of how being queer is seen as something horrible, much worse than the actual violence taking place. As a result, SV with male victims in media often has situations where the concern is less about the victim and more about communicating a fear of depraved queer individuals as the root cause. that are racial minorities, as is the case in how something like Malcolm in the Middle communicates that black men are gigantic, sexually uncontrollable beasts.
Talk shit about us. I have monstrous niggas fuck them to death in this cell. You hear me, boy? You will bleed black cock.
Terry Crews himself is also a victim of SA, and now has to challenge the dynamics that came with him being all the things society sees as hyper-masculinizing and would make him the culprit, not the victim. In fact, he's been portrayed as that predatory rapist using his large body multiple times, including the Boondocks. He's also a reminder that support is not necessarily reciprocated, as Gabrielle Union vocalized her support for Terry Crews, only to have him dismiss her own claims when she came forward about harassment. He's a reminder that he is not any less of a victim himself for this shameful behavior, but oppression and violence isn't inherently radicalizing either. He makes a useful case study on how this industry navigates SV, especially when showing the intersections of race and gender. Often, the very act of SV toward men reflects these kind of attitudes that reflect how we discuss them with real people. Don't Be a Menace does rape humor at least twice, with the gay prison rape humor toward the movie's antagonist, Toothpick. He openly declares that he's not afraid to fuck a man's ass in his Take Me to Jail speech. There's also Lock Dog's rape played as a comedic moment.
Oh no nigga, you ain't going nowhere.
This isn't strictly limited to comedy either. The framing of SV in media with men as victims often sees prison as a threat to heterosexuality, and can even see it as a way to deter men from crime, which is one of the key problems that comes up in these scared straight programs the Boondocks is depicting. It sees prison as a bad thing not because the institution is founded on violence, dehumanization, and how it criminalizes marginalized people, but instead because it turns you gay. It indirectly says the quiet part out loud. Those who are in prison and those who get raped are bad people who deserve it. For all the talk about the emasculation of black men, the attacks on black men, I think it's telling how Tom Dubois is never used as an example of this, despite his TV portrayal being a perfect example. Notice how trans and intersex men, disabled, fat, gay, bi, pan, and aro-ace men are hardly, if ever, considered in these conversations about emasculation. Tom is a black man who, despite his faults, still genuinely advocates for and speaks in defense of black women and queer people. But the show continually undermines using him as a voice of reason when he's continually emasculated and made the target of SV for comedic effect on a regular basis. He's the image incels have of a white knight. It doesn't bring attention to the atrocities of prison and policing. It doesn't give a voice to men, especially when looking at black, trans, or disabled men specifically who are generally left out of the conversation. It's patriarchy in action. Instead, prison is seen as a threat to masculinity because of the proximity to queerness. That or police who allow or participate in SV themselves see it as a last resort to enact justice toward people who supposedly deserve to be raped. None of that serves prison abolition. The Booty Warrior is not an episode about prison abolition. It's a pile of queerphobic rape jokes that has Huey give a brief sentence about the industry before going right back to business. The sentiments behind the framing in the humor of this episode serve the exact opposite end goal of what Huey is discussing. What does it say when the most vocal presence calling out queerphobic and misogynistic views is framed like this? What does it say when the Boondocks can be labeled as this challenging and bold satire for bringing in a serious talk about SV in the trial of R. Kelly, but hardly a peep is said about the ways that the Boondocks directly plays into that very same rape culture that supports men like R. Kelly? I feel like conversations like this, and discussing black film, television, and the Boondocks specifically, don't get to happen because it's easy to look at the story of Gangstalicious Part 2, or the trial of R. Kelly, and discuss the series in very binary terms. I'm not telling anyone that these are secretly bad episodes or that you should hate them, but I bring them up to highlight the way that the Boondocks is often held on this pedestal, where seasons 1 through 3 are seen as infallible, insightful media, and we perpetuate this myth that only season 4 fails to join them because Aaron was removed from the series. You can see this contrast in how Tom is treated versus the dynamics of SV with women as the perpetrators. More often than not, these are scenes designed to be structured in a way that still sexualizes the women if she's conventionally attractive, and frames it as something that the guy should be happy about or congratulated for. Anissa from the Invincible comics, spoilers for what happens, but she showed up in season 2, and people who have read the comics know that later on she rapes one of the main characters. Knowing that, several people are calling her muscle mommy, saying that her victim is lucky, saying that they want to switch places, and you can't find a comment section on anything about her not doing this now. When it's presented as something more gross and perverse, it's not done because the act of rape is something horrible, but because the rapist is someone who is undesirable. Their fatness, transness, being dark-skinned, or disability is framed as a disgusting punishment for the victim. In the case where women are victims, it's often framed in a way that doesn't center the victim, and is instead a motivating factor for a male character's emotional journey instead. It can often be used as a way to give women a sort of comeuppance at their expense too. It treats rape as if it were a property crime and not something done to another person. There are also instances where we're expected to sympathize with the rapist in some way because the rape is framed as something that was inevitable. Take the My Wife and Kids episode, Celibacy, where the wife, Jade, decides to follow the advice of a sex book she was reading and go without sex for 6 months. She and her husband, according to the book, would flirt for, in her words, a typhoon. Michael grows impatient with this, with the joke being that men cannot function without sex and are entitled to it from women. So, what does Michael do? He intentionally gets his wife drunk and then fabricates consent by asking her if it's okay, knowing she'll say yes because she's drunk. That's rape, buddy. This is a form of marital rape presented not only as normal and funny, but inevitable. What we see in several of these cases is an underlying entitlement to women's bodies and to sex. It's framed in a way where rape is only a bad thing if it is seen as a way to queer or emasculate men, if it can be used to motivate a male character when a woman or girl is the victim, or if the rapist is considered undesirable in some way. In Canada, a judge made a remark in the trial that a 17-year-old who said she was essayed by a 49-year-old man is, in his words, a little overweight but has a pretty face, and may have been a bit flattered by the attention. Fat bodies are seen as so disgusting and worthless to this judge. A teenager would be flattered by being essayed by a grown man because they never expect to be loved in any capacity. This dissonant attitude is also how you get cases like the Persona series. Persona 5's first villain is a teacher at your school who is abusing students, including essaying several of the girls. One of your party members, An, gets blackmailed because he wanted to essay her by threatening her friend who was also being abused. The deciding moment that pushes you over the edge to take him down is when An's friend Shiho walks off the school building, feeling that unaliving herself is the only way out. The game does all of this, but then you can go on to date multiple adult women yourself, including your own teacher at the very same school. The same game also constantly mocks An, who I will remind you spent the first portion of the game being blackmailed by her teacher and was nearly essayed. After this moment though, nearly every chapter has others in her party who all know this happened to An, sexualizing her or having others harass her with it being framed as a joke. Persona games have several moments where you engage in voyeurism, with it being framed as a natural part of being a boy, where you spy on girls, watch scenes of them being objectified in swimsuits, maid outfits, or bathing. The comeuppance they receive for taking part is still largely presented as comedic, or if they are brought into focus, their punishment is receiving sexual attention from fat, old, or trans women, as is the case in Persona 3 and 4, which is trapped within the desirability framework we discussed earlier. Persona 4 is especially egregious when you consider the murderer you've been searching for the whole game is also an attempted rapist, yet the game constantly makes humor out of Yosuke pressuring the girls, or Teddy outright assaulting them. Persona 3 Reload came out earlier in 2024, and keeps in the moment where your teacher finds you irresistible, because it's designed as a fantasy that assumes that any boy would love that from older women. Even playing as a girl doesn't change this, because you can still romance an elementary school age boy at one point. But what does that really say about how we can have several scenes of rape, SV, and still communicate these ideas about boys and men, about entitlement to women's bodies, and about sex still needs to occur from a very specific type of people who society deems as undesirable, otherwise you're a queer or an unfeminine man who is less than. What does it say when these sentiments find their way into children's media as well? Powerpuff Girls, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Paddington all have prison rape jokes of some kind.
Rocco, I've been impounded. You gotta come bail me out. Hurry!
I'll come down to bail out my car. It's that red one over there.
Oh yeah, the other car's calling fancy fenders.
Did you see what that bear just did to that guy's cherry?
I think that just cured me.
What does it say when the entire premise of Coming to America, the sequel that is predicated on rape? What does it say when Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It mishandled the portrayal of rape to the point where even the creator acknowledged his own screw-up? The protagonist ends up deciding to be with her rapist at the end of the story, something Spike Lee has reportedly called one of his biggest failures. I hope it's obvious that I don't have a problem with the inclusion of SV in media. It should be discussed more and given the respect and care it deserves. But the problem is that so often it communicates and reinforces the very underlying behaviors that contribute to rape culture. These issues aren't strictly confined to comedies either. Even works that attempt to frankly and seriously depict or discuss SV still end up with these problems. To any of the guys out there, particularly to the cis men and boys, this is the kind of thing that we as a whole are taught about sex, about masculinity, and women and girls' bodies from the moment we're born. Even if you're not attracted to women, it still shapes the way we talk about SV, about our own masculinity, and about rape culture as a whole. We have a responsibility to learn more about this and to make a real effort to call it out. I'm not here to convince people to stop watching the Boondocks or whatever, because the problem goes beyond a silly TV show. If you take nothing else from this, take the conversation about desirability and how it can be manipulated to justify violence toward marginalized people with you. A large part of this is also shaped by the demographics of people who have access to the film TV production space to begin with. Tom Dubois is a valuable character to analyze the broader use of SV in the Boondocks. The show presents him as one of the only voices to speak in defense of women, especially black women, one of the only characters to challenge queerphobia. But those moments are undermined in how the show routinely emasculates Tom and uses SV at his expense to continually belittle him. I know the R. Kelly episode gets a lot of praise, but it's hard to watch it in isolation knowing how the rest of the series treats and discusses SV. It's much like the story of Gangstalicious Part 2 in that respect. So I think it's reasonable to ask, what does the Boondocks have to say about sexual violence? The answer is loud and clear. The episode starts with Riley watching a white, presumably gay student, we don't actually know that, dancing, and Riley tells him to cut it out because it's gay. This leads to him becoming a pariah after the video of it goes viral, and a gay rights activist organization speaks out about Riley's hate speech. We also see Ellen DeGeneres condemn Riley's behavior. Riley then makes a response that everyone who's criticizing him is gay, which is not helping his case. But then he says that everyone has outie buttholes, which then prompts another organization that advocates for the research of outie buttholes to criticize Riley for stereotyping them. It's this response here that showcases the core problem of the episode. This episode is set up in a way that seems to intentionally make Riley sound hypocritical and in the wrong because, frankly, he's homophobic all the time throughout the series, which even this episode points out. But it's undermined by the way this episode also tries to frame this as Riley being unfairly victimized by overly specific, overly sensitive people trying to extort him or take advantage of the situation. The chanting of the protester says, "Bully, bully, stay back. Gay is the new black." And we see what the angle really is. The episode here is trying to assert that Riley is a victim of unfairly exploitative white people and how it imagines queer people as only white. We see this in how every major character or referenced figure in the queer community is white. The queer community is portrayed as a bunch of vicious animals unfairly targeting a child, which undermines the fact that Riley is regularly used to perpetuate homophobia within the show. Anytime we see the very few black queer characters in the crowd, they're in alignment with a sea of almost entirely white faces, and all the characters with spoken lines are white. The idea of hustlers and clout chasers like Ann Coulter and a mixture of other black hustlers is an interesting idea, but we're never challenging that idea on the erasure of black queer people. The show does make exactly one acknowledgement of black queer people, from Uncle Ruckus, who mentions that he hates both niggas and faggots, especially when they're combined into one, like RuPaul. Oh hey, remember how in Pause I mentioned that rise in visibility in the 2010s? Looks like they were not immune to that. We see this idea repeated several times, that the episode just assumes we're on board with the idea that gay people are completely accepted and completely untouchable within American society.
We're done for. Why gays? Why couldn't it have been Mexicans or Indians from India? Everyone makes fun of them.
The New Black relies on the same narrative sleight of hand that every black cishet person does in using this. It imagines queer people as white queer people attempting to leverage some kind of power over black people. It assumes that justice for queer people is always met in ways that it is not for black people, which is not true. This isn't true even among just white queer people, because violence, poverty, medical discrimination, housing insecurity, and denial of access to resources still affects you even when you're white. That isn't to say that there are not issues of homonationalism, especially as we continue to see with the ongoing genocides. The queer community is full of anti-blackness, ableism, fatphobia, including from white queer people specifically. But cis-het black people constantly bringing this up, like the Boondocks and the history of black comedians doing this, are not acting on the interests of bringing about liberation. Things go from bad to worse when Rollo Goodlove enters the scene, remarking that he can't make things worse. You pissed off the fags, they don't ever forgive. Black cis-het comedians do this to the erasure of black queer people all the time, and it's clear the Boondocks can only imagine white queer people in any meaningful way here, because to acknowledge black queer people in this would cause the whole thing to fall apart. I'm not being homophobic, I swear, I just have issue with white gay people who have unchecked power over everyone and just want to feel oppressed. What we're seeing them do here is have black cis-het people adopt the oppression of black queer people and position themselves as advocates for the communities. It's from that adopted oppression that they then try to act as if they are being pro-black in repeating decades of queerphobic talking points while erasing black queer people and harming us in the process. In fact, we're fully aware of the ways that we can strategically weaponize race language to advance that, because there was already an episode that did this, the R. Kelly trial. It brought up this exact behavior. Now, are there problems of anti-blackness within the queer community? From white queer people specifically? Absolutely, no argument here. But that doesn't mean what we're seeing here, or what we see from other black cis-het people, is in any way some kind of pro-black argument, because they refuse to challenge this problem. The only time they do acknowledge queerness within the black community is a method of forced assimilation, when they attempt to use bioessentialist rhetoric to argue that you're black before you're gay.
Before my mother knew my gender, before she had a due date, before she even knew if she was actually going to keep me, she knew that I was black. How? Because my mother is black and my father is black. I was black before I was born. So I have a problem with individuals who try to compare the plight of the black community with the plight of the LGBTQ community. Now, here is where people are going to start to get upset. You are not born gay. You are not born trans. You are not even born straight. Gender identity and sexual orientation require you to first be self-aware. You need to know that you are a person before you can have a preference. If the government were to decide today that we were not allowed to have any individualism at all, we all had to wear the same brown paper bag, it would be a lot harder to identify members of the LGBTQ community. But I would still be completely unquestionably black. But I find it odd that a community that fought for the right to identify in a manner of their choosing is then going to turn around and try to impose a label onto another community. It doesn't make sense to me. And then you go ahead and tell that community, if they don't accept the label that you are imposing on them, they are now a bigot. And let's be clear, this is not the entire trans community. Based on my observation, and again, you may have noticed different, this is coming predominantly from white trans women, meaning these individuals were white males at birth. So even though they transitioned, they still somehow maintain this superiority complex and this urge to subjugate women. I find that very interesting.
Notice how this conveniently imagines trans people as only white women saying these things. Because to acknowledge that cis is the counterpart to trans is to acknowledge trans women as women, and thus require cis women who haven't considered them to rethink their understanding of gender. Nobody is subjugating you by calling you a cis woman. That's what you are. So we instead have this qualifier that, oh, it's mostly white trans women who say this, and those white women were socialized as men because they were male at birth. So they're actually oppressive white men talking over a black woman. By effectively shifting this as a perspective held just by white women, who in the same sentence you immediately strip of womanhood, you can attempt to discredit a very basic concept in black feminism. You see how strategically using white women allows you to erase an entire issue of transness and just say the quiet part out loud. If a black trans woman or a black trans femme person said the exact same thing, the logic falls apart. And guess what? They did. We can easily just look up an example. Describing a woman as cis is no different than describing them as tall, black, perisex, disabled, or dark-skinned, all of which can be descriptors used to give more nuanced discussions in feminist spaces. It's not subjugation to use descriptors that name different lenses through which we can better understand ourselves and the space we navigate. Because people like this don't want to challenge these beliefs about queerness, gender, and how it relates to blackness, they have to construct this image that it's white trans women who were once white men and thus socialized as such. Something black trans feminists have explicitly brought up as a common talking point leveraged against black trans women and black trans femme individuals. The New Black tries to have things both ways, in how it tries to use 3 degrees of satire but continually redirects who the target of the joke is in every scene. For example, after Goodlove says the fags don't ever forgive, Huey immediately calls him out on saying maybe if you'd stop calling them slurs they'd be more understanding. It seems like the joke is on Goodlove, but it's undermined by Goodlove's response. He complains that, oh, you can say nigga all you want, but fag gets censored, and Riley follows it up with thank God for uncensored DVDs. This is in relation to the fact that if you watch the Boondocks on live TV on Adult Swim, they would regularly censor homophobic slurs but not the N-word. Let's be real here, it's a meta joke about the Boondocks, something they've done countless times throughout the show, and it ends up directing the target of the joke to act like Goodlove is more reasonable than he actually is, and how the writers use him to air out a supposed contradiction from the executives. So the show does regularly call out Rollo Goodlove for his behavior, but it also treats him as a voice of reason too. Likewise, the show routinely recognizes that Riley is homophobic and not helping his cause, while genuinely seeing him as unfairly being targeted. There's a constant hard line drawn between homos and niggas to the erasure and annoyance of black gay people. It's also made much worse by this specifically being CeeLo Green portraying Goodlove, because CeeLo Green is both homophobic and a rapist. With the introduction of Sweet Love, a white gay activist set out to extort the Freeman family, we also have a bunch of stereotypical jokes about LGBTQ people, like gay men being inherently effeminate, Riley getting grossed out by bisexuality, and jokes where Sweet Love is framed as a sexual predator trying to assault an 8-year-old child. They misunderstand him, and even Sweet Love himself is annoyed by it, asking, "What is wrong with you people?" But the joke is still laid out with the dramatic music, the way the camera gives this sinister mood and how it zooms in on his face, and how the lines he has, such as saying we need to give of ourselves and how he wants Riley. So again, predatory gay stereotype here goes unchallenged.
Just relax and do exactly what I tell you. It may hurt a little at first, but it'll be over before you know it.
So Riley then does a recording session with the joke being that Riley keeps doubling down on his homophobia, like saying, "Don't say no homo, it's offensive to fags." This also plays a big part in how it undermines this idea that Riley isn't a victim, which the show keeps going back and forth on. But it's also just a group of cishet writers injecting the use of homophobic slurs as comedy. Once Riley's press conference goes sour, they end up having Rollo Goodlove capitalize by claiming that Riley is mentally disabled, and he flips the narrative on the gay people who are now in hot water with the public for attacking a disabled boy. Oh, Jesus Christ. It's bad enough we had this homophobia, but now we're throwing ableism into the mix as well. The newscaster uses the term cognitively impaired, only to receive a note saying he used the wrong term, and him freaking out asking, well, what is the goddamn correct term then? This then prompts disabled people, again predominantly white disabled people, to start speaking out against the gay community. The shots of the disabled people are intentionally designed in a way that uses them as mockery. One guy has a sign that says, "I can marry," in response to the gay people, and that's not true at all. In fact, it's a serious issue because of the structure of forced poverty. And the few fixed income options like Social Security for disability essentially means you cannot get married without having threats to your income and healthcare access. Several of the disabled people hold signs that don't make sense or even relate to the protest at hand. They make sure to draw several of them in a mocking fashion. The framing of the disabled people in these shots in this episode are designed to evoke disgust, as if the idea of disabled people is just inherently an object of mockery. Ruckus shows up again to point out how happy he is to see the Coons and the Benders tearing each other down. And as much as I wish we were watching an episode of Legend of Korra with Ruckus in it, he's just here.
This is a good day for me, cause I love it. Nothing makes me happier than to see the Coons and the Benders tear each other down. I apologize for my outburst.
Apparently Ruckus draws the line at ableism, even as he's used to make a bunch of film references that have strong examples of ableism at the expense of black men. One of them is especially messed up in how Ruckus references The Blind Side. Michael Oher has filed a lawsuit and has petitioned to end the conservatorship he's been under and the way those are used to strip people of agency. This episode is basically the F and R slur every 2 seconds. Things go from worse to much worse with the introduction of, get this, Filbert Slow Love. Slow Love. He's basically Debo from Friday, and based on his manner of speaking and all the stereotypes like his constant insistence on strawberry milk, the episode constantly infantilizes him because he's disabled. Slow Love speaks very slowly as if he's a 5-year-old and how he repeatedly asks for milk, but then he's also exceptionally talented at drawing. They seem to be throwing together several different disability stereotypes. Riley repeatedly still refers to him with the R slur and doubles down on his ableism, while they imagine this idea repeatedly that people only exist to extort others for causes. This scattershot approach to satire, where the target of the joke is just kind of everyone and all over the place, makes the episode really spineless and confused in what it's trying to say, beyond just reveling and being able to be homophobic and ableist. The final scene is Riley showing up to the track event he's extorted into doing. He wears a helmet because, well, he's mentally disabled, or at least faking it, so of course he would. I want to mention that there are several reasons to wear a helmet, but the episode is not interested in those considering the constant mockery. Riley mentions he enjoys being mentally disabled because he can use it to get out of doing work and not be held accountable for anything. The Boondocks already has quite a few episodes that engage in ableism. In addition to its constant use of ableist slurs, we also have the ending of Ballin', in which Riley loses to an autistic boy based off of Jason McElwain, who shows up to humiliate Riley with a bunch of references to films like Rain Man and Forrest Gump. The episode repeatedly mocks autism and perpetuates various stereotypes about autistic people. The framing of the episode, particularly from the announcer, imagines McElwain as every autistic stereotype imaginable, and how he's utilized as an object of humiliation for Riley. McElwain is inspiration porn to Tom's frustration, with the announcer only treating him as a one-off savant, aka a 2-for-1 special on ableism stereotypes. There's a reason Rain Man or Sheldon Cooper gets used as an insult toward autistic people. There's also earlier episodes like The Real that lean on the disabled faker trope, and how Robert fakes being blind to get free things and has it backfire horribly. This could be its own video with how often disabilities are portrayed more often through people faking them than having an actual disabled person. In short, this repeated trope sells a form of ableism not necessarily through the character doing the faking, but in the world and reactions around them. We see this trope come up very often, and I think there's a bit of misunderstanding about why it persists so much.
Bart, to avoid this test, you've had smallpox, the bends, and that unfortunate bout of Tourette's syndrome.
Well, I'm not sure I'm over it.
Shut it, witch!
It represents a fantasy that imagines the idea that countless people at any point can and would fake disabilities in order to gain sympathy, gain resources, or get out of doing work. If there's a diagnostic criteria, it's nowhere near stringent enough. The issue isn't, wow, this person is faking being disabled, I'm going to go out and copy Bart Simpson now. The issue is more in how people look at disabilities with inherent scrutiny. To say you can't trust any disabled person because they just want handouts, or they're just doing this for attention. We really need some kind of authority or institution to regulate this. As a result, it becomes a way not to glorify faking, but instead to support institutions that officially label you as disabled. Healthcare institutions represent a socially acceptable form of violence toward disabled people, because the fundamental role of such places does not center actually caring for or about patients. That's why right now we're seeing an increased criminalization in masking, despite it being a basic public health action. It represents a means of targeting protesters, disabled, queer, and non-white people who still mask. The image of Riley faking disabled supports the belief that if you claim to be disabled, everyone will bend over backwards for you and be completely accommodating and understanding. You can say or do whatever you want without consequence, which is why we need to be vigilant about fakers. Now, ask literally any disabled person and you'll quickly know that this is not the case. In fact, many times it's the exact opposite, and that you have to hide your disability if you're even able to, because it's used as a way to infantilize you, to rationalize violence toward you, stigmatize you, have you institutionalized, ignored, or killed. This is what makes moments like The Real or The New Black so ableist in concept. It's not because someone will replicate that and fake being disabled because they watched the TV show, but instead how writing like this continues the narrative of viewing disabled people with an inherent suspicion, and how they implicitly encourage trust in formal institutions to crack down on these out-of-control fakers. This policing also contributes to further stigma that makes it far more difficult for disabled people who haven't discovered yet that they're disabled to even figure it out. Riley ultimately gets a form of comeuppance for his behavior, and is treated as the butt of the joke. But the problem is that the joke at his expense is still reliant on us co-signing the inherent suspicion toward disabled people. It still comes with the underlying assumption that queer people are mostly just powerful white people who can unfairly target black people. It still relies on the inherent disgust toward disabled people. Riley is told to run, and he begins to look conflicted after seeing the faces of the disabled people. He's not conflicted at recognizing the harm in his behavior, or because he sees them as people, but because Riley is disgusted by the idea of being associated with them in taking a photo for a disability organization, which the show is already framing as a punishment for Riley and his behavior. The episode shows us several shots of the disabled people's faces for us to take in just how disgusting we're meant to see them as.
No way, man. Get me out of here. I ain't trying to be around these.
That's a bad word. You're not supposed to say that word.
The episode ends with Riley being chased down and catching an ass beating. That sucked. I'm sorry. I'm really trying to keep it chill, but cut me some slack here. That was disgusting, dog. See, the thing with comedies like this is that it's not about free speech or making fun of everyone. They know it's all bullshit. It's not even about being funny, because most of the times they're just repeating the bigotries over with literally no style or humor to it. It's about building a shared community around a shared idea of exclusion. This is how you get moments like Dion Cole making a stand-up routine about anti-black racism, and then he complains about cancel culture and sensitivity when he uses lesbophobic slurs in the same routine. Dave Chappelle would go on to continue this in later years up to the present, most notably his very blatant trans misogyny in The Closer. The prevailing narrative was much of the same we see here, because he employs a similar communication tactic the Boondocks uses. He uses a scattershot approach to his satire, wherein the target of his joke repeatedly shifts. He tries to make it seem like he's playing the role of a bigot to poke fun at and mock, but he's really just strategically espousing homophobic and transphobic beliefs in a way that erases black queer people, particularly black trans people, from the conversation. Any supposed critique he's making of DaBaby is undermined by him making the exact same comments that reinforce the same beliefs about HIV and AIDS being inherently queer and dirty, which by the way is a sentiment that harms black cishet people too, and how there were and are still racial disparities. AIDS is worsened because it's weaponized by a state that enacted eugenics. The whole reason he opens on a bit engaging in Asian racism with C-19 is to build up to comparing it to HIV and AIDS because this aired early on in the still ongoing pandemic. What Chappelle is doing is positioning queer people as an inherently privileged and specialized group that gets unquestioned recognition. This is Chappelle's grift, scattershot and speak implausible deniability, but ultimately reinforce the same belief that's been perpetuated for centuries. He makes it seem like he's making fun of this viewpoint, even though he outright defends the beliefs behind it both before and after this moment. So while he is speaking out against things like the trans bathroom legislation and the way that it treats trans people, there's still an element of disgust and fakeness to trans women and how they have unchecked power, according to Dave. He mentions that he checks their bodies to see if they're real women, and that he is inherently disgusted by their bodies, which is why he places focus on her live meaty dick, in his words. It's trans misogyny. That's why he defends J.K. Rowling. That's why he routinely imagines queer people as obscenely powerful, and why the only mention of black women and black queer people are all individuals who conveniently either agree with him or are massively misrepresented in how he talks about them. He mentions having a trans friend 61 minutes in, and mentions the story where she never makes any corrections or challenges anyone on misgendering or pronouns, so to Dave, the only good trans person is one who never challenges you on your gender essentialism. Even his story about her doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and how he tries to frame her as a victim of the woke mob. If Dave was really satirizing homophobia and transphobia, he would not victimize Kevin Hart and DaBaby. He would not have misgendered and dead-named people. He would not have repeated the centuries of trans misogynoir that he did. In 846, Dave Chappelle talks about police violence in reference to George Floyd, but can only ever imagine said victims as black boys and men, and even then they're assumed to be straight and cis. He doesn't grapple with how police violence disproportionately targets black disabled people, such as Ryan Gaynor, a black autistic boy murdered at only 15. He doesn't reckon with the way his rhetoric about trans people directly contributes to trans violence. He refuses to acknowledge black trans men and other transmasculine individuals. Take righteous Torrance Chevy Hill, a black man murdered in February of 2024. Chevy was a salon owner in Atlanta. But hey, Chappelle does manage to take the time to call a woman a bitch multiple times. But it's okay guys, she's a white woman, so that makes it totally not misogynistic. I won't acknowledge any black women as victims of police violence, and I'll make a whole bit of how I expect women to act if they don't want to be unalived. There's also evidence suggesting that there was a homophobic joke worked into 846 that was still left in subtitles but removed from the footage. This wasn't some fall from grace or even some new shit, because even the Chappelle Show was full of homophobic and misogynistic shit that you can see in his current work too. And this specific image and idea of cishet black men standing up and speaking out against queer people who have unchecked power in society has years of precedent.
everything J.K. Rowling does, including breathe, is transphobic. What did J.K. Rowling say exactly? I don't fucking know. I never researched it. All I know is she's transphobic based on the Twitter feeds of my peers.
It's not just mindless hate based off of Twitter threads. We know exactly what J.K. Rowling did and is still doing. And it's not just mean words on Twitter. It's the fact that Rowling's influence extends directly to the political sphere. Several trans people have gone through an extensive amount of effort in the face of harassment and threats directly caused by her to lay out all the things she's done and said, to fact check her and debunk her harmful and wrong claims. But that doesn't actually matter for this video, because it exists not to be accurate or even comedic, but instead to build a shared community out of normalizing and getting to openly be queerphobic. Bernie Mac did it in Be a Man. Eddie Murphy did it in Delirious and Raw. Before that, we had Richard Pryor at the Hollywood Bowl. Back in 1977, he performed for a humanitarian event and went off at the fact that it seemed to be a queer rights advocacy group full of wealthy white people. Richard Pryor is also a slightly different case, as he's both black and bisexual. Now, his issue in this context was the event being branded as a human rights event, but was really a gay rights event with a sea of white faces that couldn't even name the event as one for gay people. I bring this event up not to actually look at the intentions or beliefs about Pryor himself, but more in what cishet black people reacting to it take from it, in branding him this divine truth teller. Furthermore, this same event also saw Pryor go on to pit social welfare against women's rights. And it's all the same. The attraction to comedians for doing this, regardless of the comedian's intentions, plays into the same beliefs each time. It's not about comedy, it's not about sensitivity. And having the same conversations over and over about punching down won't get through to people, because they miss that it's about building community around a shared idea of hate, one that's been in the world for years. Why? Because it's beneficial and grants a form of power within an oppressive society. That's all this is. It's not about being pro-black or speaking in defense of anyone. It's a self-serving power grab. People like this, like Long Beach Griffey, like any of the content creators you see out there that shuck and jive or build their platform around their bigotry, don't just pop up randomly. Digital platforms encourage this and give black people a unique space to align with white supremacy in doing so. YouTube as a platform isn't really all that different from the broader industry of film and TV, and the kind of corner cutting and reaction rage baiting it promotes. Actually having to work to put something together takes time and labor. And it's much easier and encouraged by the platform itself to do and say the most reactionary things possible, to not think or care, and to be rewarded for doing so. This is further supported by data in prior years, according to the Hollywood Jim Crow, which shows similar disparities throughout the 2000s and most of the 2010s. This is also a major contributing factor to how we get these issues like rampant misogynoir, ableism, and queerphobia within black media. The people who have access to this space to begin with are not all equal or inherently considerate people, so often they are people willing to align themselves in some way with this white status quo. Their discussions of race are part of a brand, and only extend to what affects and benefits them personally. Something I feel cannot easily be quantified with studies like this, and I feel makes them incomplete, is the way it measures blackness in neutral terms, as if to say that any black person is inherently a positive or uplifting or even a positive depiction. This is how you get situations like the Boondocks. The blackness within that space is one that is still handpicked and centered largely at the whims of a white audience. The people who get access, the resources they're allocated, and the expectations they're reviewed with all factor into that. Black disabled people will rarely be brought into the conversation in a meaningful way, because of the nature of inaccessibility both in living in the spaces where film and television production takes place, and also within the spaces themselves. The same real-world structures that force poverty onto black queer people is still present in this space as well. Film and TV needs to be seen by more reviewers less as this artistic space where everyone is just out to show off what they can do and be the best of the best, and more a hand-picked, engineered program through which only the wealthiest and those aligned with them are hand-picked to support the interests of the status quo. Any deviation from that is only done if it is seen as low risk or financially lucrative. So while yes, the Boondocks has significant issues in how it depicts many of the topics it navigates, those issues can't just be individualized to these people, because the broader structure of the industry directly contributes to this result. And I'm not saying this as an expose or a way to be like, fuck the Boondocks. I wouldn't spend this much time on something I hated. I also don't say this as a way to try and minimize the attitudes discussed here, or to say that there wasn't any degree of personal agency involved. On TikTok, Uncle Ruckus is still very much a meme as a way to be anti-black. He's become a symbol of mockery, even to the point where you just need his theme music to communicate that. I don't think this destroys the fabric of reality or anything, but it does feel very minstrelly to have Gary Anthony Williams as Uncle Ruckus chatting it up with Elmo about the white man. What does it say when the likes of Cat Williams and CeeLo Green, both of whom have a history of queerphobia and CeeLo Green with sexual violence, then get to continue shaping the media landscape? Michael Cheat, Eddie Murphy, Bernie Mac, Chris Rock, Cat Williams, Dave Chappelle, the queerphobia of the Wayans brothers. None of these bigotries exist as just individual choices that come from nowhere, but are a direct result of hand-picked black people who will continually support the derogation of other people within black communities. In that sense, I ask, what is a black show, really? I don't think we've truly imagined what black media can look like, because it always exists within the whims of white minds. Like, you can say it's a show or series with a predominantly black cast, but that doesn't mean it's not shaped by the sensibilities of white audiences. We don't even have to look at extreme examples like Good Times. You can observe cases like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. While a film like Norbit had a predominantly black cast, it still had Brian Robbins as director and John Davis as producer. Eddie Murphy also produced this and had black people like him also producing and making decisions for the project. Robbins is also the CEO of Paramount at the time of writing. We can look at cases where we feel seen, like Across the Spider-Verse or Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, but they exist under corporations and leaders that openly support genocide. This makes it feel hollow to have genuine conversations about them without having to qualify it under, yeah, pirate this, which still has issues too. What does it say about how much black minds are seen as a commodity that a biopic about James Baldwin, a black queer activist, is involving Billy Porter, who can't even show the basic respect for the very issues Baldwin cared and wrote about in the first place? He's just a character to these people, not a real person with actual views and beliefs that are still relevant to advocate for today. To Billy Porter, Baldwin is nothing more than a means to get the bag. Black faces in high places doesn't mean a thing. I'm not saying don't feel anything toward any black art, that none of it is good or that this is all worthless. I like most of the works I've discussed in this video. Absolutely boycott these companies though, especially Marvel and Disney. This isn't to erase genuine pushes and labor done to push the boundaries of what's acceptable, or to say that black media is worthless and we need to disappear from it. I'm not saying no black talent has ever done anything right or moving or revolutionary. Only that our perception of it exists within the confines of white supremacy. We can't individualize these issues as just a few bad actors and need to name the bigger issue.
The man!
This is also why I don't like describing these problems as saying the show didn't age well or that it's a product of its times. Phrases like this, intentional or not, end up normalizing and protecting this kind of behavior. It implies that things like queerphobia are newly discovered issues and that the people behind them could not have done better, that they just didn't know any better, or that they're owed slack. What it doesn't account for is the structure of the industry. The Boondocks wasn't transphobic or homophobic because it was the 2000s or 2010s, or that people were simply inherently more homophobic, or even because the public as a whole just didn't know about trans stuff. It's not projecting modern values onto an older art form to point out that transmisogyny didn't exist in isolation, and that the greater visibility toward it was in reaction to the larger media focus at the time. Pause and the Booty Warrior didn't age poorly. They were concepts dead on arrival even back then, and as a direct result of not choosing people who would know better to have a place in the space. The Boondocks failed to consider perspectives involving black women and queer people because the kind of people who would know better are systemically expunged from the space, not because we're listening and learning and getting on a better linear path. Collective social progress and knowledge are not linear. It also erases the voices, discourse, and nuance of older time periods to frame them as inherently more regressive. People in the 1960s weren't just inherently more racist. Which people specifically are we talking about? Poor representation in most instances is the result of people best equipped to navigate it not being given any meaningful or genuine space to discuss it. We don't need to keep moving the needle. We don't need incrementalism. What we need is to change the structure entirely. Ableism isn't some product of the times. These issues of Saneism, of institutionalization, of attempting to pathologize people to rationalize violence toward them, of eugenics are all still here and present right now. Quoting Noah Berlatsky, who wrote about this, None of this is to deny the importance of historical context. Of course it would be silly to dismiss Jane Austen as sexist because her female characters look to men for financial security rather than leaning in to become CEOs. But one important historical context is that inequalities of race, gender, and class, to name just three, have been around for a very long time and aren't going anywhere. Good Times, which aired in the 1970s, is a perfect example. The show was full of anti-black racial stereotyping, but it wasn't because it was just the 1970s and people didn't know any better. Black people sure as hell knew better, which is why several of the black actors and writers critically spoke up about it. What caused this to stay was centering white sensibilities, and showrunners blacklisting and firing anyone who did know better at the time. Describing something as a product of its times in this context only seeks to erase the nuance of the past and sanitize our present as just enlightened. Saying Pause wasn't a product of its times when nearly every black man Let's Player with a large platform on social media feels the need to say it every 2 minutes still now. We don't get to say that the Booty Warrior is projecting modern values when black comedy channels and TikToks are throwing No Diddy in everywhere they can get. How you choose to act now in the present is how you would have acted in any previous time period too. As long as there has been an unjust status quo, there have always been people to defend it and people to challenge it. No amount of historical revisionism will change that. The Boondocks does a lot of things really well, and I'm not one to deny the massive influence it has within the black media landscape. But I think we also need to be mindful in how we talk about these works in such an uncritical way that props them up on a pedestal. Like, describing the show as just it got bad because Aaron wasn't on it anymore not only erases the deadline-driven, exploitative, anti-black nature of the industry, it creates a cult of personality in imagining these products as just the result of one great man, erasing everyone else's involvement in the process. It also makes it far more difficult to have genuine critical discussion of seasons 1 through 3. We can point to the story of Gangstalicious Part 2 as the Boondocks being ahead of its time, but not when it's used to sidestep discussing how homophobic and specifically trans-misogynistic the rest of the series was. We can look at an episode like The Trial of R. Kelly, and praise the Boondocks for daring to discuss sexual violence, rape culture, and defending abusers because of the attachment to the entertainment they provide. But not without talking about how the Boondocks contributes to that very rape culture it's critiquing by how it portrays sexual violence throughout the rest of the series. I think it sidesteps the fact that this is a consequence of the unequal structure of Hollywood, which I don't feel enough reviewers bring into focus when having these conversations, about how exploitative the industry is that it necessitates striking. There are also multiple details that support that Aaron McGruder was involved in Season 4's production. He worked on it. Setting aside how much of it still matches his usual writing style and set of references, a Thought Crimes interview from Carl Jones mentions that they had a falling out after Season 3, which would have left Aaron McGruder handling a far greater workload and several tasks that Carl Jones was normally doing that he had less experience in. You also have to consider the voice talent Carl offered with characters like Magnificent. Essentially, Aaron didn't want Carl working on other shows while also working on the Boondocks, because Carl was branching out and doing his own thing on the side. They had a falling out over this and Carl left, which resulted in production falling behind. Moranzio Vance also alludes to the same thing in another interview. You may also notice that Angela Nissel is listed as the writer for a lot of Season 4 episodes. I remember a lot of the misogynistic reactions when Season 4 first came out, and people were shifting blame of the show's quality onto her. But she's not just some random woman they thoughtlessly brought on. She and McGruder have years of history. She's the one who helped lay a lot of the groundwork for Jasmine's character, and in many ways helped shape the Boondocks into what it is as well. To try and lay blame with her for what was largely Aaron's decision-making is to do a major disservice. There are several other interviews out there that support this. I'm not saying this as some expose, and I don't plan on exposing their personal lives and history, but I say this instead to challenge how the Boondocks often gets talked about. It's easy to take this moment of Season 4 and isolate it from the rest of the series, as well as the broader image of the industry. You can have the funniest, most talented artist in the world, and it won't mean anything if you put them through crunch or put them on hard, unrealistic deadlines. Aaron McGruder is not a genius. I'm not saying that as an insult, but to push back against the way he's propped up in a way that not only sidesteps all the other problems we talked about, but is dehumanizing to Aaron McGruder himself and is unrealistic. It's a collaborative work done in a profit-driven industry. That's why we can't really have conversations about the way the Boondocks and other media drop the ball on the subjects they portray without looking more broadly at white supremacy in the industry itself. The production team would have strongly benefited from more black women, black queer, and black disabled voices to say, get this shit out of here. But that can't easily happen with the way people capable of doing that are pushed out of this industry. Yes, I critique the production team's leadership individually for how they handled it. But I also critique the structure of the industry itself for how it repeatedly creates these conditions. We won't ever see change if we don't also recognize the issues of exploitation and see the film and TV industry for the propaganda mill that it is. A lot of the Boondocks was created under extreme stress, pressure, and deadlines, to the point of Aaron McGruder's hospitalization. I keep coming back to Aaron McGruder's introduction in one of his books, where his mindset is, we don't have time to reflect on things. There's the next deadline. Everything here, I say with love. One of my favorite moments in the entire series encapsulates everything we're talking about. It's the end of the episode Riley was here. Nobody believes a black boy like Riley can be talented, and the white neighborhood doesn't respect his art until there's no black person to tie to it. They're willing to think piece it, take credit for it, pay money for it, but not in a way that respects the feelings or credit to the black creator. Also, Bob Ross with a gun is funny as hell, I won't lie. But it also ties back to that same relationship with black art and media. It's structurally set up to be like this. It's set up to exclude you, but it doesn't mean there can't be something beautiful within that. To me, having genuine critical discussion about the Boondocks represents being able to recognize the effects this industry had on Aaron McGruder's health. It means recognizing the still relevant issues of exploitation that get obscured by how often this is just entertainment for us. It means not laughing off queerphobia, misogynoir, rape culture, and ableism as just others being too soft, and recognizing who really benefits from us thinking that way. This was a huge effort. The research for this video alone took me about 4 months, even when I already knew a lot about the topic going in. There's also writing, recording, and editing. If you want to support me, I'd much rather you support other black queer people out there who could use a donation far more than me, and plenty of black advocates have already compiled GoFundMe lists. There are also multiple ongoing genocides in Haiti, Palestine, Sudan, the DRC, Tigray, and more. If you can afford to, consider donating to support people directly affected by these genocides too. Focus Congo has been vetted by numerous advocates speaking about the DRC for years now, and is a great way to support the people of the DRC. Advocating for the Democratic Republic of Congo looks a bit different from the situation in Palestine and the others. The other big thing you can do to support is to minimize the amount of technology you buy, including phones, computers, and other similar devices. Use your things until they break down. When you reach the point of needing to replace things, purchase things refurbished. The main driver is the mining going on for cobalt in coltan, which is used in most of the technology we use. While tech companies like Apple and Google are some of the big hitters, it is tech from all companies because of the materials used in their production. Thank you for watching.